Hey everybody, this is chapter 6 of Gregory Elliot's book, Althusser, the Detour of Theory. Chapter 6 is titled The Eclipse, The Eclipse of Althusserianism. Quote, "At last the crisis of Marxism has exploded," end quote. Louis Althusser in the article, The Crisis of Marxism. In chapters 4 and 5, the theoretico-political positions arrived at by the later Althusser were examined. The bulk of Anglophone commentary on his work posits one main caesura in it: the break between the Althusser of 1960 to 67 and the Althusser of 1967 on, between the exponent of the theory of theoretical practice and the militant of the class struggle in theory, between the self-declared defender of Marxism and the professed partisan of Marxism-Leninism, and it is not wrong to do so. Yet this discrimination can be made at the price of overlooking or obscuring a more profound mutation in Althusser's career: the distance which separates the self-confident champion of the scientificity of Marxism from the herald and interrogator of the quote, crisis of Marxism, and where attention has been paid to that complex phenomenon, the crisis of Marxism, there has been no comparable focus on the crisis of Althusserianism by which it was accompanied. The crisis announced by Althusser in Venice in November 1977 in fact concerned three overlapping and interlocking crises which, taken individually or collectively, were somewhat narrower in scope than a crisis of Marxism as such. 1. A crisis of Marxism-Leninism which weighed with particular gravity on the Maoist French left. I guess like the Maoist French left, or Mao-adjacent French left. 2. A crisis of capital C communism induced by the vicissitudes of Eurocommunism as a, quote, third way between Stalinism and social democracy and implicating the Communist Party of France. And 3. A crisis of Althusser's Marxism infected with theoretical and political skepticism as Maoism collapsed, Eurocommunism stalled, and, quote, actually existing socialism, and, quote, stagnated in the second half of the 1970s. The paradox of this last crisis was that whilst it involved renunciation of many of the theoretical leitmotifs of Althusserianism, it simultaneously permitted a significant political reorientation from Maoism to, quote, centrism, or to left Eurocommunism. From Maoism to, quote, centrism to, quote, left Eurocommunism. Where many of Althusser's peers and ex-students abandoned any kind of allegiance to Marxism, Althusser himself emerged as a communist militant critical of his party and its history, but equally unaccommodating to his enemies on the right. New section, Marxism Yesterday and Today. In June 1975, a jury of the University of Picardy heard Althusser's defense of his, quote, doctoral thesis, and, quote, comprising his work between 1959 and 1965. In what Le Monde described as a, quote, astonishing performance, and, quote, Althusser explained how his, quote, philosophical intervention was the work of a member of the Communist Party acting ... within the labor movement and for it, end quote. Althusser. How in order to influence the real prince, capital P prince, the leadership of the Communist Party of France, Althusser had spoken in the name of an imaginary prince. How, emulating Lenin's What Is to Be Done, he had, quote, bent the stick, end quote, in the direction of theoretical anti-humanism to combat Gorodism, and so on. How Althusser had practiced the class struggle in theory so as to challenge, quote, the ideological hegemony of the ruling class. The, quote, ideological hegemony of the ruling class, end quote. Althusser. Footnote, quote, the politics which constitute philosophy, end quote, writes Althusser, quote, bear on and turn around, ... the ideological hegemony of the ruling class. The ideological hegemony of the ruling class, whether it is a question of organizing it, strengthening it, defending it, or fighting against it, end quote. Althusser. This theme was taken up in Althusser 1975 and in the book La Transformation de la Philosophie, a lecture given at University of Granada in March 1976. In the latter, Althusser argued that contra Stalin's, quote, terroristic practices, end quote, just as the post-revolutionary state should be a, quote, non-state, end quote, preparing its own disappearance, so Marxist philosophy must be a, quote, non-philosophy, end quote, a, quote, new practice of philosophy serving the proletarian class struggle without imposing upon it an oppressive ideological unity, but rather creating for it the ideological conditions for the liberation and free development of social practices, end quote. Althusser's brief invocation of Machiavelli to explain his, quote, extremism, end quote, is illuminated in the conclusion to the lecture dating from 1977 titled Machiavelli's Solitude. End footnote. In Althusser's Sultans, parenthesis, published in revised form in October of the same year in La Pensée, in parenthesis, Althusser did not speculate on the fate of his theoretical intervention or on its political fruits, but he did make, or rather repeat, a remark of some importance for his future evolution. As a theoretical discourse with scientific pretensions, historical materialism was under an obligation to progress, to provide, quote, new knowledge about imperialism and the state, and ideologies, and socialism and the labor movement itself, and ideologies and socialism and the labor movement itself, end quote. Althusser. Quote, Marxist theory can fall behind history and even behind Marxist theory's self if it ever believes that it has arrived, end quote. Althusser. So in June 1975, Althusser was defending, albeit in qualified form, his theoretical project in the early 1960s, ascribing to it an ambiguously anti-Stalinist political significance, and claiming that his writings from 1967 onwards had made some of the necessary amendments to the original theses. More generally, Althusser was characteristically postulating the existence of a scientific theory, historical materialism, which could be defended philosophically and which, as a research program, was open to, indeed required development. The continent of history discovered by Marx remained to be explored. Among the territories to be charted were the histories of socialism and Marxism. In the last chapter, some doubt was cast on Althusser's political self-evaluation. On this occasion, however, his promises were partially fulfilled. In 1976, Lacour published a major study of Lysenkoism in the Theorie series titled Proletarian Science, to which Althusser contributed a short but remarkable introduction titled Unfinished History. In strong contrast to the silences of the books For Marx and Reading Capital, and the ambiguities of the book Reply to John Lewis, Althusser explicitly returned to the formative years of his own Marxism, the Cold War in theory. Deploring the silence of the Communist Party, Soviet Union, and fraternal parties alike, he noted that, quote, an extraordinary paradox, asserts itself here, just as it does in the case of the terrible reality, later baptized by the derisory name of, quote, personality cult, unquote, and in many other episodes in the history of the labor movement. The communist parties, provided by Marx for the first time in history with scientific means of understanding history, seem to be powerless to account as Marxists for their own history. Especially when they have made a mistake, end quote. Althusser. Althusser disparaged the pseudo-rectifications made by the Communist Party Soviet Union and the Communist Party of France and invoked the authority of Lenin for the claim that, quote, the labor movement must analyze and understand its past so that it will not be fighting in the dark, end quote. The, quote, primacy of Marxist politics. The, quote, primacy of Marxist politics, end quote, dictated a historical materialist account of the USSR and the communist movement, bearing on the profound causes of errors, not merely the visible effects of an unanalyzed and uncriticized cause. The root cause of Lysenkoism had been left unexamined and unrectified, not because the means were lacking but for political reasons, a consideration which led Althusser to what was easily his most outspoken reflection on Stalinism past and present. It was time to, quote, stop telling ourselves stories, end quote, Althusser concluded, and to pose the, quote, simple but serious problem, end quote, what social relations today constitute the Soviet social formation? Quote, what social relations today constitute the Soviet social formation, end quote. Althusser offered no response to his question here, though he did take the opportunity to rectify his book Reply to John Lewis by now characterizing the, quote, political line of the Stalin period as one of, quote, economism and voluntarism, end quote. Instead, Althusser turned to the Lysenko episode, remarking the Communist Party of France's, quote, vanguard role in the Lysenko episode, and the fact that the Stalinist, quote, ontological version, end quote, of dialectical materialism, guaranteeing Lysenko's theories, had been treated to a superficial rectification which preserved its substance and its, quote, apologetic function, end quote, as a practical ideology, quote, glorifying the existing state of affairs, end quote. Althusser. Histoire terminée, histoire interminable. I don't know if I'm saying that right. What prompted Althusser's most forthright condemnation of the Stalin period, his first written indictment of continuing repression in the USSR and, quote, elsewhere, parenthesis, China as well as Eastern Europe, question mark, and parenthesis, and Althusser's criticism of the Communist Party of France's evasion of the issues involved is not known, but it can be surmised. Althusser's question was on the agenda. If one man could be said to have put it there, it was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the first volume of whose Gulag Archipelago appeared in 1974, parenthesis, the year its author was exiled, in parenthesis. In the mid-1970s, freelance French Marxists suddenly discovered the Gulag, and it came as a revelation of Damascene proportions. In a move diametrically opposed to Althusser's call for a Marxist analysis of the history made in Marxism's name, many followed the Russian novelist in assigning responsibility for that history in Marxism. First off, the Mark was the former leader of Gauche Proletarienne and sometimes Clausewitz of French Marxism, André Glucksmann, with La Cuisinière et la Mesure de Homme, I don't know what that translates as, published in 1975, an ideological extravaganza hailed by fellow theoretical anti-humanist and leftist Michel Foucault, who now declared Stalinism to be, quote, the truth of Marxism. Glucksmann followed this up 2 years later with the book The Master Thinkers, a Parisian irrationalist version of Popper's Open Society and Its Enemies, which had some stern words for Althusser. The Nouveau Philosophes proper were introduced to the French public by their most assiduous and sententious self-publicist, Bernard-Henri Lévy, in June 1976. I'm not sure if it was Bernard Lévy, but he was he was also a Maoist. I'm pretty sure he was, at least. I think he went by a different name. He went by a nom de plume or nom de guerre or whatever you want to call it. But I'm pretty sure Bernard-Henri Lévy was a Maoist. Just like André Glucksmann. Solzhenitsyn, Lévy informed readers of Les Nouvelles Littéraires, quote, plays the same role for these people as Althusser played 10 years ago, end quote. Precisely once, Marxism had been all-powerful because it was true. It engendered such marvels as the Cultural Revolution. Now Marxism was all-powerful because it was scientific and gave birth to monsters. By a simple reversal of moral signs, an angelic was converted into a diabolical scientism. Marxism, totalitarian science, and science of totalitarianism remain the demiurge of history. Quote, if we have any objection against Marxism, end quote, Foucault confided in 1976, quote, it lies in the fact that it could effectively be a science, end quote. Foucault. Qua scientific discourse, Marxism secreted a will to power whose truth was the Gulag. Or as Lévy put it in his popularization of the self-styled, quote, new philosophy, La barbarie à visage humain, of 1977. Quote, the Soviet camps are Marxist as Marxist as Auschwitz was Nazi, end quote. Levy. The coincidence of Solzhenitsyn's epic and the debacle in China thus unleashed a concerted ideological campaign which recycled the themes of the Cold War, not, quote, socialism or barbarism, end quote, but, quote, socialism equals barbarism, end quote, quote, communism equals Nazism, end quote. In September 1977, Time magazine, exultant of the intellectual renversement des alliances on the left bank, splashed its front cover, quote, Marx is dead, end quote. And indeed, by the end of the year, what has been termed a, quote, new, quote, Parisian consensus, end quote, an anti-Marxist one, had crystallized. As Dews and others have argued, the political and theoretical perspectives of post-68 gauchisme, which is like leftism, which that's what it translates as, prepared the ground for the nouvelle philosophie, new philosophy. In his text on May 1968, titled Strategy and Revolution in France in 1968, André Glucksmann had opined, quote, that beneath the ballot papers survives the revolutionary situation disclosed in May, end quote, and concluded, quote, the horizon is revolution or counter-revolution, end quote. André Glucksmann. This is the immediate horizon of Gauche Proletarienne, a Maoist organization formed from a fusion of elements of the UJC and the Mouvement du 22nd Mars. In an issue of Le Thème Moderne, devoted to, quote, New Fascism, New Democracy, in 1972, Glucksmann expounded its ultra-leftist political perspectives. That reaction, the Pompidou regime, took the form of a, quote, fascism from on high, end quote, that it was buttressed by a social fascism beneath. The PCF, which had saved the day for capitalism in 1968, and that the revolutionary movement must organize a, quote, new popular resistance, end quote, against it, imitating the exemplary actions which would stimulate the masses to rebellion and thence to a people's war. In the event, it was in Italy and West Germany that analogous phantasms were acted out by the Red Brigades and the Red Army faction. For the most part, the ultra-leftists of the Latin Quarter gratified their image as, quote, new partisans, end quote, with rhetorical terrorism against Gaulists and their, capital C, communist collabos, or collabo. Only in their hands did the critique of arms replace the weapon of criticism. Important for our purposes is that this anti-Sovietism that Maoists had learned from the Communist Party of China and the anti-communism they promulgated in a Gallic rerun of the, quote, third period, end quote, could easily slide into an outright anti-Marxism. And this is exactly what happened in the mid-1970s when, having founded on its own fantasies, the ultra-leftist anti-Leninist spontaneism and populism preached, if not exactly practiced by the, quote, servants of the people, end quote, metamorphosed into a romantic philosophy of power and ethic of resistance, a critique of capital C communism, into a critique of Marxism per se, in the subsequent revaluation of values, May 68, and its gauchiste aftermath were perceived, in Foucault's words, as, quote, something profoundly anti-Marxist, end quote. Michel Foucault. Marxism was now identified with a technocratic authoritarian practice of politics, whose terminus was l'enfer concentrationnaire. Capitalism had once equaled fascism, now it was socialism's term. The Communist Party of France's behavior in May and June had not been an aberration, but an exemplary instance of Marxism's complicity with raison d'etat, reasons of state. Marxism was incapable of explaining the USSR because it was responsible for the USSR. In the shape of the Communist Party of France, it had been hostile to May 68 because the Prague Spring was inimical to its totalitarian project. Few recantations have been as abject as this collective desertion. The utterly unoriginal critique of Marxism fashionable in France in the second half of the 1970s went through the motions of distancing itself from the right. Yet its popularity with Time, Giscard d'Estaing, et al. Was scarcely fortuitous. That's Giscard um, apostrophe Estaing at all, was scarcely fortuitous, but rooted in its recuperation of May 68 and the dominant ego-libertarian ideology of May for the free world. The regrettable truth, however, is that the born-again anti-Marxists would never have succeeded in palming off such a melange of Camus, Popper, Solzhenitsyn, and Foucault as anything but rehashed Cold War ideology had it not been for the Communist Party of France's derelictions on the subject of Stalinism. In Paris as elsewhere, it takes two to tango. If the threat posed to the French social order by the Union of the Left made the expiations of the enrage, quote, expedients. Let me read that. If the threat posed to the French social order by the Union of the Left made the expiations of the enragés, quote, expeditions of some timely men, end quote, Nietzsche, the occasional superficial criticism of the Brezhnev regime ventured by the PCF leaders from October 1975 onwards were seen for the opportunistic adjustments to the exigencies of electoral opinion they were. One second. The PCF's posthumous loyalty to Stalinism and concomitant illusion of serious research and debate on the Soviet experience returned to plague it even as its post-1956 strategy apparently neared success. Where anarchism had constituted a punishment for the sins of opportunism, anti-communism was the nemesis of residual Stalinism. The questions posed by Althusser in 1976, then, were already being answered with stockpiles from the Cold War repertoire. The Parisian consensus was, in Foucault's words, that, quote, those who hope to save themselves by opposing Marx's real beard to Stalin's false nose are wasting their time, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Kalinikos, 1982. And footnote. Any Marxist account of the, quote, unfinished history, end quote, would receive a not-so-polite refusal in the best salons. Even as Althusser announced an end to storytelling, another kind of story became a bestseller. Historical materialism found itself ruled out of court by the confluence of two currents, the new philosophy and post-structuralism. The alliance Althusser had sought in the early 1960s unraveled after 1968, as the philosophers of desire and power, tributary to May, drove high structuralism from the seminar room. Althusserianism was thus doubly compromised, as a Marxism and as a structuralism. Althusser's soutenance betrays an insouciance, insouciance, oblivious to the major, if largely implicit, challenge that had been mounted to historical materialism in such works as Deleuze and Guattari's book Anti-Oedipus of 1972 and Foucault's Discipline and Punish of 1975. No response from the Althusserians was forthcoming, as post-structuralism swept all before it. With Glucksmann, the, quote, transition from classicism to romanticism, end quote, affected in the French philosophy post-May, took an explicitly anti-Marxist turn, and what the, quote, deconstructionist and, quote, philosophical challenge to Marxism had been unable to accomplish was achieved on the ideological Kampfplatz in record time. By 1977, historical materialism was generally regarded as theoretically and politically discredited in France. A fight back was long overdue. If one senior Marxist philosopher could have been expected to shoulder the task, the obvious candidate was Althusser. In the event, Althusser revealed himself incapable of it. Althusser came less to defeat his antagonist on a head-on confrontation than to underwrite, albeit unwittingly, by demission and default, some of their pronouncements. In the early 1960s, Althusser had hitched Marxism to structuralism's rising star. In the second half of the 1970s, Althusser proved powerless to meet the challenge of the post-structuralism that emerged from its forebear. And it was precisely the Marxism-Leninism with which Althusser had aligned himself in a retreat from, quote, structuralism after 1965 that was most immediately put in question by his fellow countrymen. When Althusser came to deliver his paper on, quote, the crisis of Marxism, end quote, to a conference organized by the Italian group Il Manifesto on the subject of post-revolutionary societies in November 1977, the theoretical confidence and combativeness of former years had evaporated. Previously for Althusser, the significant crisis of Marxism had been that which commenced with the 20th Congress of the CPSU. Now, in contrast, Althusser postulated a crisis of a much longer duration and graver dimensions whose contemporary acuity paradoxically offered an opportunity for Marxism. As Althusser explained at the beginning of his text, the challenge to Marxism was to be met by accepting the reality, but attempting to transform the meaning of the, quote, crisis of Marxism, end quote. First of all, what was this crisis? Quote, a phenomenon which must be grasped at the historical world level and which concerns the difficulties, contradictions, and dilemmas in which the revolutionary organizations of struggle based on the Marxist tradition are now involved. Not only is the unity of the international communist movement affected and its old forms of organization destroyed, but its own history is put in question, together with its traditional strategies and practices, end quote. Althusser. Bereft of, quote, any real living reference for socialism, end quote, and haunted by Stalinism, Marxists were on the defensive. This state of affairs could not be ameliorated by provision of the requisite analysis of Soviet history, for, behind the failure hitherto to supply it, there lay, quote, the extreme difficulty, and perhaps even the present state of our theoretical knowledge, almost the impossibility of providing a really satisfactory Marxist explanation of a history which was made in the name of Marxism, end quote. Althusser. If Marxist theory was not responsible for the history made in Marxist theory's name, it was implicated in and, quote, compromised, end quote, by it. The conjoint political and theoretical crisis of Marxism could be met by ignoring it or weathering it in expectation of better times to come. A third possibility, one endorsed by Althusser, was, quote, to view the matter with sufficient historical, theoretical, and political perspective in order to try to discover the character, meaning, and implications of the crisis. If we succeed in this, we can then start talking in a different way and emerging from our long history, instead of stating that, quote, Marxism is in crisis, and, quote, we can say, quote, at last the crisis of Marxism has exploded. At last it is in full view, exclamation point. At the last something vital and alive can be liberated by this crisis and in this crisis, end quote. Althusser. Far from being a, quote, recent phenomenon, end quote, the crisis dated back to the 1930s. It was then that, quote, Marxism, which had been alive, living from its own contradictions, became blocked, entrenched in, quote, theoretical, end quote, formulae, within a line and practices imposed by the historical control of Stalinism, In doing violence to what Marxism had been, with its openness as well as its difficulties, Stalin in effect provoked a serious crisis within it, but in the same act he blocked it and prevented it from exploding. End quote. Althusser. The current eruption did not simply visit destruction, but in liaison with the popular struggles of the 1960s and 1970s, held out the promise of a, quote, possible liberation and renewal, end quote. Althusser. Yet there was no longer any question of a return to Marx, a la Althusser. Quote, we cannot consider our historical, political, and even theoretical tradition as a pure heritage, which was distorted by an individual called Stalin, or by the historical period which Stalin dominated, There is no original, quote, purity of Marxism that only has to be rediscovered. During the whole testing period of the 1960s, when we, in our different ways, went, quote, back to the classics, end quote, when we read or reread Marx, Lenin, and Gramsci, trying to find in them a living Marxism, something which was being snuffed out by Stalin-type formulae and practices, we were all forced, each in our own way, even even within our differences, to admit the obvious, namely that our theoretical tradition is not, quote, pure, that contrary to Lenin's over-hasty phrase, Marxism is not a, quote, block of steel, end quote, but contains difficulties, contradictions, and gaps, which have also played at their own level their role in the crisis, as they already did at the time of the Second International, and even at the beginning of the Third Communist International, while Lenin was still alive, end quote. Althusser. Marxism was not a seamless scientific web. Marx had laid the foundations of what Althusser now defined as, quote, a theory of the conditions and forms of the class struggle in capitalist societies, end quote. Althusser. But this theory was incomplete and bore the imprint of the dominant bourgeois ideology of its time, by which it had been penetrated throughout its history. The classics themselves were flawed. By way of illustration, Althusser pointed to what he termed the, quote, fictitious unity of Marx's capital and the purely quantitative theory of exploitation, derivative from Marx's capital. Althusser alluded to the, quote, enigma of Marx's philosophy, the dialectic announced by Marx, fashioned in positivist and evolutionist form by Marx's successors, and catechized by Stalin. Moreover, Althusser perceived, quote, two theoretical gaps of great importance. In Marx and Lenin's contributions. The theory of the state and of revolutionary organizations. As to the first, Marxism did not present a theory as such, only injunctions to avoid what Lenin called, quote, constitutional illusions, end quote, a crippling political lacuna. As for the second, again, Marxism lacked a genuine theory of the, quote, functioning, end quote, of political parties and trade unions, leading to the dual danger of a reproduction of bourgeois forms in the process of their contestation, and a, quote, fusion of state and party / unions in any post-revolutionary social order. Footnote. In an interview with Rossana Rossanda for Il Manifesto in December 1977, Althusser elaborated on these points, arguing that Marx, as if, quote, paralyzed by the bourgeois representation of the state, politics, etc., end quote, had never proceeded to the, quote, critique of politics, end quote, which must accompany his, quote, critique of political economy, end quote, nor had his successors. But this was a vital requirement. Quote, above all, it is a question of not reducing politics to the forms officially sanctioned as political by bourgeois ideology, the state, popular representation, political struggle over the possession of state power, political parties, etc. If one enters into this logic and remains in it, one risks falling not only into, quote, parliamentary cretinism, end quote, but above all into the juridical illusion of politics. For politics is defined by political law, and this law consecrates, and only consecrates, the forms of politics defined by bourgeois ideology, end quote. The, quote, totally unforeseen political initiatives, end quote, of the ecological and feminist movements, for example, constituted a potentially fruitful new departure, which both challenged, quote, classical bourgeois forms of politics, end quote, and put in question the Marxist conception of politics and the party. Quote, profoundly contaminated by bourgeois ideology, end quote, the organizational form of the communist parties was modeled on the bourgeois political apparatus and characterized by the separation of leaders from ordinary militants and of the party from the masses. Theoretical rectification and practical transformation were urgent, since the Communist parties must preserve their quote exteriority and quote autonomy vis-a-vis the state if they were to act as one of the instruments of the quote withering away unquote, of the post-revolutionary state and hence of communism. End footnote. The issues of state and party have been dramatized by the powerful mass movements that had arisen in Italy, Spain, and France, and we might add by the Cultural Revolution. They were, quote, burning political questions, end quote, the answers to which would help determine the fate of the social and labor movements alike. At the same time, mass practice furnished a condition of possibility for the resolution of the crisis, which itself represented a, quote, historical opportunity of liberation, end quote. Marxism, Althusser concluded, quote, has in its history passed through a long series of crises and transformations, ... We are now, in the present crisis, faced with a similar transformation, bracket, to that which occurred after the collapse of the Second International, Gregory Elliot, in bracket, which is already finding its roots in the struggle of the masses. It can bring about the renewal of Marxism, give new force to Marxism's theory, modify its ideology, its organization, and its practices, opening up a real future of social, political, and cultural revolution for the working class and for all working people, end quote. Althusser. Among the first to demur at Althusser's diagnosis was Ursula Schmiederer, who protested in her contribution to the same conference that it was not Marxism which was in crisis, but Marxism-Leninism. As we shall see later, Althusser was not alone among the leading lights of West European Marxism in detecting symptoms of a general crisis in Marxism in the 1970s. Nevertheless, it is the case that the crisis began as a crisis of Maoism before spreading to the ranks of communist parties, disoriented by the misadventures of Eurocommunism. The omission from a text eloquent on the subject of Stalinism of the slightest allusion to the experience of Maoist China, Althusser's lately deceased, quote, really living reference for socialism, end quote, is surely the crucial index here. Deprived of this, quote, reference, Althusser's long-standing disenchantment with the USSR found unequivocal expression. When the Red Star over China fell, Althusser's Marxism was precipitated into crisis alongside that of his leftist critics, impelling him to his Venetian ruminations. Althusser is to be faulted not so much for the perception of a crisis as for his delineation and treatment of it, for the focus and tenor of his remarks, the crisis of Stalinism and the communist alternatives to it, was amplified to implicate Marxism tout court. Althusser's intervention was thus hardly calculated to arrest the advance of anti-Marxism. Belated recognition of the fact that Stalin, rather than Khrushchevism and theoretical humanism, represented the veritable crisis to be welcomed. Having recently joined them, however, Althusser erred in conceding the territory that independent Marxists had fought to hold. Indicative of this syndrome was his pessimism as to the capacity of historical materialism to provide a convincing account of the Soviet social formation. It combined belated distance from Maoist simplicities with dejected assertions about the obstacles to any materialist explanation of Russian history, a proposition dear to the hearts of the new philosophers. Apparently unaware of the disarming implications of such a conclusion, Althusser compounded it by proceeding to query the independence of Marxism from Stalinism. Again, insofar as this constituted an admission of his own lingering illusions about Marxism-Leninism, it can be applauded, but to the extent that it implied a contamination of Marxism in toto, it is unbalanced and, to say the least, does an injustice to those who learn their Marxism elsewhere than in the short course and in the Little Red Book. It can be objected to Althusser's periodization that locating the emergence of the crisis, quote, for us,
in the 1930s is a revealing imprecision, suggesting a residual myopia. Yet this would be somewhat beside the point. For the significant thing was that Althusser now forswore any return to a pristine historical experience or to the Marxist-Leninist classics, announcing problems of a politico-theoretical nature in Marx and Lenin themselves. Naturally, there was nothing pernicious as such in this appreciation. What Marxist outside Tirana would gainsay it, only in the extravagance of its enunciation. It was as if, having discovered that the return to Marx of the 1960s had been accompanied by presuppositions from Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy, and that the rectifications of his own Marxism had been mortgaged to Maoism, Althusser was projecting these specific shortcomings onto Marx and Lenin, just as he had once precariously projected Marxism and Leninism onto the Cultural Revolution. The immediate consequences of the new theoretical skepticism emerged in his declaration that Marxism lacked a theory of state and politics, a judgment which confused prevalent schematism, theoretical underdevelopment, and a dearth of strategic thinking with sheer absence. Moreover, the Marxist philosopher, who had been second to none in the vehemence and fastidiousness with which he asserted the gulf separating historical materialism from all species of bourgeois ideology, cavilling at the complacence of his contemporaries, was now to be heard regretting its contamination by 19th century ideological motifs. Therewith, the herald of Marx's revolutionary singularity endorsed the claim made by Foucault in 1966 and canceled the epistemological break. From being the science of history, historical materialism now dwindled into the problematic commencement of a theory of capitalist society. What must change in Marxism was left unspecified, but on this account anti-dogmatism with a vengeance. It was little short of everything. To be sure, the tone of Althusser's address was incongruously optimistic. It ended on an almost exultant note. Althusser's reflections on Marxism did not, however, warrant any such optimism. Reacting against his own former theoreticism and Marxism-Leninism, Althusser settled a personal account. In the process, Althusser lent his prestigious voice to a refrain hardly conducive to dispelling mere melancholy and encouraging the collective effort required for an alleviation, let alone resolution, of the crisis. Indeed, Althusser's pronouncement could be interpreted as handing over much of the Marxist legacy to its detractors, a countersign rather than a counterstatement. What was in effect an autobiographical balance sheet assumed the airs of an official court of inquiry, which neglected to call other witnesses and hear other evidence. Judge and jury, Althusser proclaimed a crisis of Marxism and looked to its salvation in popular practice. The hopes invested in the advance of Eurocommunism, which sustained Althusser's affirmative conclusion, were to receive their quietus at the hands of the Communist Party of France leadership and French electorate the following spring, and then a crisis of French communism and Althusserianism exploded. New section: The Crisis of Communism. We have seen that in the mid-1970s, historical materialism came under fire in France from the batteries of the post-structuralists and new philosophers. By the end of the decade, a paradigm preeminent in French intellectual culture since the liberation had been rooted. Such fire as was returned by Althusser at least was insufficient to hold up the enemy advance. Yet, if Marxist theory and with it the reputation of, quote, actually existing socialism, and suffered a dramatic reverse in these years, the mass communist parties of Western Europe were on the offensive for the first time since the resistance. With the end of the post-war boom, a specter was haunting Western Europe and the State Department: Eurocommunism. May 68 and the Italian, quote, hot autumn the following year were a turning point, for although the reunification of revolutionary theory and practice, considered imminent by some in an era of dual crisis of capitalism and Stalinism, failed to materialize. The communist parties of Italy, France, and Spain were the main beneficiaries on the Marxist left of the upsurge in working class and popular militancy in Europe at the turn of the decade. The repressed class politics returned. With the onset of capitalist crisis, what Curio termed or Carrillo. I don't know I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I mean, I know if he was Spanish, you'd say Carrillo, so I'll just say Carrillo. Carrillo termed the, quote, Euro-communist road to power, end quote, was the order of the day. The novelty of the Euro-communist manifesto consisted in its explicit divergence from Comintern canons in an attempt to adapt socialist strategy to the conditions of bourgeois democracy under advanced capitalism. It comprised acceptance of a gradualist and constitutional conception of and strategy for socialism, envisaging an eventual rupture with capitalist polity and economy. This involved, to a greater or lesser degree, public distanciation from the Russian model. As distinct from Soviet-style socialism, the Western article would be democratic in means and ends. National and constitutional roads to power had a respectable pedigree in Khrushchevism. What converted this latter-day variant into a Western schism in the communist movement was the autonomy from Moscow it claimed as a prerequisite of its project. Impelled by the Brezhnevite consolidation in Eastern Europe, which had disappointed the promise of Khrushchevism, the communist parties of Western Europe drew further away from the socialist mother country and closer to their own national traditions. In Italy, the PCI made its, quote, historical compromise, end quote. In Spain, the PCE entered a, quote, pact of freedom, end quote. And in France, the PCF signed a common program with the socialist and left radicals, sealing a union of the left, which is widely expected to triumph at the polls in March 1978. Eurocommunism, then, entailed at least de facto renunciation of, quote, Leninism, quote, Leninism, that had been official orthodoxy, however pro forma, for decades. In the PCF's case, de facto reorientation away from the Comintern heritage became de jure abrogation when it was proposed in February 1976 at the party's 22nd Congress that the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, should be excised from its statutes. The nuanced response this elicited from Althusser, titled On the 22nd Congress of the French Communist Party, signposted his own evolution away from quasi-Maoist political positions. In a contribution to the discussion leading up to the 21st Congress in October 1974, Althusser had entered various caveats about the Communist Party of France strategic formulations without by any means dissociating himself from them. He now effectively demarcated his own position both from the official Communist Party of France orientation and from Comintern orthodoxy, giving the 22nd Congress a guarded welcome and seeking to disengage what he regarded as its many positive features from the negative ones. It was, Althusser wrote, a, quote, decisive event, a crucial, quote, turning point in the history of the Communist Party and the French workers' movement, end quote. Althusser, convened amidst a double crisis of imperialism and the communist movement, the Congress represented an attempt to break out of the, quote, historical impasse, end quote, constituted by the crisis of the latter, and forge a new strategy which could bring the, quote, new forms of struggle, end quote, invented by popular movements in the era of detente, to fruition. Quote, never, Althusser believed, had they been, quote, so powerful, end quote, victorious in the third world, advancing in the first. Having warned that it would nevertheless be perilous to underestimate the capacity of imperialism to respond to these challenges directly or by proxy, Althusser moved on to discuss what he delineated as the 6 initiatives of the 22nd Congress. First, despite strong reservations on the theory of state monopoly capitalism underpinning Communist Party of France strategy, Althusser endorsed the perspective of, quote, democratic socialism, end quote. Althusser. Secondly, Althusser registered an agreement with the Communist Party of France's program on the unprecedented possibility of a, quote, peaceful and, quote, democratic transition to socialism given the changed global balance of forces. Thirdly, as regards abandonment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, Althusser argued that the deliberations had been notable for the absence of their real referent, Stalin. Since the policy document asserted the, quote, leading role, end quote, of the working class in a, quote, broad popular alliance, end quote, Althusser had no quarrel with it, considering it congruent with Marx and Lenin's theses on the indispensability of alliances. What was unsatisfactory was the ceremonial abrogation of the dictatorship of the proletariat without any discussion of the historical balance sheet of the Soviet experience and the international communist movement. The Congress had ignored Stalinism, domestic and foreign, decreeing the abandonment of the dictatorship of the proletariat on the grounds of its potential confusion with fascist dictatorship. This would not do. The reality of Soviet socialism under Stalin must be openly addressed. Quote, the list of examples provided to show that the word, quote, dictatorship is intolerable, forgets to mention Stalin, not just the individual Stalin as such, but the structure and confusion of the Soviet party and state, the line, quote, theory and practices imposed by Stalin for 40 years, not just in the USSR, but on the communist parties the world over, end quote. Althusser. Oh no, that's not the end of the quote, excuse me. I am not pretending that this is a simple matter, nor for a moment can one reduce the social reality of the USSR to Stalinist practices. But fascism is fascism. The workers rapidly realized that what they could expect from it. On the contrary, they expected from Soviet socialism, in which they placed all their hopes for emancipation and liberation, something quite different from the regime of mass terror and extermination which held sway beneath Stalin after the 1930s, and the practices that persist in the USSR 60 years after the revolution and 22 years after Stalin's death. Yes, there were the Red Army, the partisans in Stalingrad, unforgettable, but there were also the trials, the confessions, the massacres in the camps, and there is what still survives, end quote. Althusser. In revoking the Marxist and Leninist category, the Congress had performed a, quote, symbolic act, simultaneously adopting a, quote, different socialism from the Soviet variety, democratic socialism, and taking an implicitly critical position on the USSR. The, quote, theoretical meaning, end quote, of this, quote, scientific concept, end quote, had not been broached, a consideration which led Althusser to the sanguine conclusion that it would reappear on the agenda. After a brief discussion of the slogan, quote, Union of the People of France, end quote, Althusser came to the crucial issues raised by the concept. The issues of state and party had been dramatized by the powerful mass movements that had arisen in Italy, Spain, and France, and we might add by the Cultural Revolution. They were, quote, burning political questions, end quote, the answers to which would help determine the fate of the social and labor movements alike. At the same time, mass practice furnished a condition of possibility for the resolution of the crisis, which itself represented a, quote, historical opportunity of liberation, end quote. Marxism, Althusser concluded, quote, has in its history passed through a long series of crises and transformations. We are now in the present crisis faced with a similar transformation, bracket, to that which had occurred after the collapse of the Second International. Gregory Elliot, in bracket, which is already finding its roots in the struggle of the masses. It can bring about the renewal of Marxism, give new force to its theory, modify its ideology, its organization, and its practices, opening up a real future of social, political, and cultural revolution for the working class and for all working people, end quote. Among the first to demur Althusser's diagnosis was Ursula Schmiederer, who protested in her contribution to the same conference that it was not Marxism which was in crisis, but Marxism-Leninism. As we shall see later, Althusser was not alone among the leading lights of West European Marxism in detecting symptoms of a general crisis of Marxism in the 1970s. Nevertheless, it is the case that the crisis began as a crisis of Maoism before spreading to the ranks of communist parties disorientated by the misadventures of Eurocommunism, the omission from a text eloquent on the subject of Stalinism of the slightest allusion to the experience of Maoist China. Althusser's lately deceased, quote, really living reference for socialism, end quote, is surely the crucial index here. Deprived of this, quote, reference, Althusser's long-standing disenchantment with the USSR found unequivocal expression. When the Red Star over China fell, Althusser's Marxism was precipitated into crisis alongside that of his leftist critics, impelling him to his Venetian ruminations. Althusser is to be faulted not so much for the perception of a crisis as for his delineation and treatment of it, for the focus and tenor of his remarks. The crisis of Stalinism and the communist alternatives to Stalinism was amplified to implicate Marxism tout court. Althusser's intervention was thus hardly calculated to arrest the advance of anti-Marxism. Belated recognition of the fact that Stalin, rather than Khrushchevism and theoretical humanism, represented the veritable crisis to be welcomed. Having recently joined them, however, Althusser erred in conceding the territory that independent Marxists had fought to hold. Indicative of this syndrome was Althusser's pessimism as to the capacity of historical materialism to provide a convincing account of the Soviet social formation. It combined belated distance from Maoist simplicities with dejected assertions about the obstacles to any materialist explanation of Russian history, a proposition dear to the hearts of the new philosophers. Apparently unaware of the disarming implications of such a conclusion, Althusser compounded it by proceeding to query the independence of Marxism from Stalinism. Again, insofar as this constituted an admission of his own lingering illusions about Marxism-Leninism, it can be applauded, but to the extent that it implied a contamination of Marxism in toto, it is unbalanced, and to say the least, does an injustice to those who learn their Marxism elsewhere than in the short course in the Little Red Book. It can be objected to Althusser's periodization that locating the emergence of the crisis, quote, for us, and quote, in the 1930s is a revealing imprecision, suggesting a residual myopia. Yet this would be somewhat beside the point, for the significant thing was that Althusser now foresaw any return to a pristine historical experience or to the Marxist-Leninist classics, announcing problems of a politico-theoretical nature in Marx and Lenin themselves. Naturally, there was nothing pernicious as such in this appreciation. What Marxist outside Tirana would gainsay it? Only in the extravagance of its enunciation. It was as if, having discovered that the return to Marx of the 1960s had been accompanied by presuppositions from Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy, and that the rectifications of his own Marxism had been mortgaged to Maoism, Althusser was projecting these specific shortcomings onto Marx and Lenin, just as he had once precariously projected Marxism and Leninism onto the Cultural Revolution. The immediate consequences of the new theoretical skepticism emerged in his declaration that Marxism lacked a theory of state and politics, a judgment which confused prevalent schematism, theoretical underdevelopment, and a dearth of strategic thinking with sheer absence. Moreover, the Marxist philosopher, who had been second to none in the vehemence and fastidiousness with which he asserted the gulf separating historical materialism from all species of bourgeois ideology, cavilling at the common compliance of his contemporaries, was now to be heard regretting its contamination by 19th century ideological motifs. Therewith, the herald of Marx's revolutionary singularity endorsed the claim made by Foucault in 1966 and cancelled the epistemological break. From being the science of history, historical materialism now dwindled into the problematic commencement of a theory of capitalist society. What must change in Marxism was left unspecified, but on this account anti-dogmatism with a vengeance. It was little short of everything. To be sure, the tone of Althusser's address was incongruously optimistic. It ended on an almost exultant note. Althusser's reflections on Marxism did not, however, warrant any such optimism. Reacting against his own former theoreticism and Marxism-Leninism, Althusser settled a personal account. In the process, Althusser lent his prestigious voice to a refrain hardly conducive to dispelling mere melancholy and encouraging the collective effort required for an alleviation, let alone resolution, of the crisis. Indeed, his pronouncement could be interpreted as handing over much of the Marxist legacy to its detractors, a counter-signature rather than a counter-statement. What was in effect an autobiographical balance sheet assumed the airs of an official court of inquiry which neglected to call other witnesses and hear other evidence. Judge and jury, Althusser proclaimed a crisis of Marxism and looked to its salvation in popular practice. The hopes invested in the advance of Eurocommunism, which sustained his affirmative conclusion, were to receive their quietus at the hands of the PCF leadership and French electorate the following spring, and then a crisis of French communism and Althusserianism exploded. New section, the crisis of communism. We have seen that in the mid-1970s, historical materialism came under fire in France from the batteries of the post-structuralists and new philosophers. By the end of the decade, a paradigm preeminent in French intellectual culture since the liberation had been routed. Such fire as was returned by Althusser, at least, was insufficient to hold up the enemy advance. Yet if Marxist theory, and with it the reputation of, quote, actually existing socialism, end quote, suffered a dramatic reverse in these years, the mass communist parties of Western Europe were on the offensive for the first time since the resistance, and with the end of the post-war boom, a specter was haunting Western Europe, and the State Department, Eurocommunism. May 1968 and the Italian hot autumn the following year were a turning point, for although the reunification of revolutionary theory and practice, considered imminent by some in an era of dual crisis, of capitalism and Stalinism, failed to materialize, the communist parties of Italy, France, and Spain were the main beneficiaries on the Marxist left of the upsurge in working class and popular militancy in Europe at the turn of the decade. The repressed class politics returned. With the onset of capitalist crisis, what Carrillo termed the, quote, Euro-communist road to power, end quote, was the order of the day. The novelty of the Euro-communist manifesto consisted in its explicit divergence from Comintern canons in an attempt to adapt socialist strategy to the conditions of bourgeois democracy under advanced capitalism. It comprised acceptance of a gradualist and constitutional conception of and strategy for socialism, envisaging an eventual rupture with capitalist polity and economy. This involved, to a greater or lesser degree, public distanciation from the Russian model. As distinct from Soviet-style socialism, the Western article would be democratic in means and ends. National and constitutional roads to power had a respectable pedigree in Khrushchevism. What converted this latter-day variant into a Western schism in the communist movement was the autonomy from Moscow it claimed as a prerequisite of its project. Impelled by the Brezhnevite consolidation in Eastern Europe, which had disappointed the promise of Khrushchevism, the communist parties of Western Europe drew further away from the socialist mother country and closer to their own national traditions. In Italy, the PCI made its, quote, historical compromise, end quote. In Spain, the PCE entered a, quote, pact of freedom, end quote. And in France, the PCF signed a common program with the socialist and left radicals, sealing a union of the left which was widely expected to triumph at the polls in March 1978. Eurocommunism then entailed at least de facto renunciation of, quote, the Leninism, quote, Leninism, that had been official orthodoxy, however pro forma, for decades. In the PCF's case, de facto reorientation away from the Comintern heritage became de jure abrogation when it was proposed in February 1976 at the party's 22nd Congress that the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote, should be excised from its statutes. The nuanced response this elicited from Althusser, titled On the 22nd Congress of the French Communist Party, signposted his own evolution away from quasi-Maoist political positions. In a contribution to the discussion leading up to the 21st Congress in October 1974, Althusser entered various caveats about the PCF's strategic formulations without by any means dissociating himself from them. Althusser now effectively demarcated his own position from the official PCF orientation and from Comintern orthodoxy, giving the 22nd Congress a guarded welcome and seeking to disengage what he regarded as its many positive features from the negative ones. It was, he wrote, a, quote, decisive event, a crucial, quote, turning point in the history of the Communist Party and the French workers' movement, end quote. Althusser. Convened amidst a double crisis of imperialism and the communist movement, the Congress represented an attempt to break out of the, quote, historical impasse, end quote, constituted by the crisis of the latter, and forge a new strategy which could bring the, quote, new forms of struggle, end quote, invented by popular movements in the era of detente to fruition. Quote, never, Althusser believed, had they been, quote, so powerful, end quote, victorious in the Third World, advancing in the First, having warned that it would nevertheless be perilous to underestimate the capacity of imperialism to respond to these challenges directly or by proxy. Althusser moved on to discuss what he delineated as the 6 initiatives of the 22nd Congress. First, despite strong reservations on the theory of state monopoly capitalism underpinning Communist Party of France strategy, Althusser endorsed the perspective of, quote, democratic socialism, and, quote. Secondly, Althusser registered his agreement with the PCF's program on the unprecedented possibility of a, quote, peaceful and democratic transition to socialism, given the changed global balance of forces. Thirdly, as regards abandonment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, Althusser argued that the deliberations had been notable for the absence of their real referent, Stalin, since the policy document asserted the, quote, leading role, end quote, of the working class in a, quote, broad popular alliance, end quote. Althusser had no quarrel with it, considering it congruent with Marx and Lenin's theses on the indispensability of alliances. What was unsatisfactory was the ceremonial abrogation of the dictatorship of the proletariat without any discussion of the historical balance sheet of the Soviet experience and the international communist movement. The Congress had ignored Stalinism, domestic and foreign, decreeing the abandonment of the dictatorship of the proletariat on the grounds of its potential confusion with fascist dictatorship. This would not do. The reality of Soviet socialism under Stalin must be openly addressed. Quote, the list of examples provided to show that the word, quote, dictatorship is intolerable, ... forgets to mention Stalin, not just the individual Stalin as such, but the structure and confusion of the Soviet party and state, the line, quote, theory, and practices imposed by Stalin for 40 years, not just in the USSR, but on the communist parties the world over, end quote. Althusser. Actually, that's not the end of the quote. The quote goes on. I am not pretending that this is a simple matter. Not for a moment can one reduce the social reality of the USSR to Stalinist practices, but fascism is fascism. The workers rapidly realized that what they could expect from it. On the contrary, the workers expected from Soviet socialism, in which they placed all their hopes for emancipation and liberation, something quite different from the regime of mass terror and extermination, which held sway beneath Stalin after the 1930s, and the practices that persist in the USSR 60 years after the revolution and 22 years after Stalin's death. Yes, there were the Red Army, the partisans in Stalingrad, unforgettable, but there were also the trials, confessions, the massacres in the camps, and there is what still survives, end quote. Althusser. In revoking the Marxist and Leninist category, the Congress had performed a, quote, symbolic act, simultaneously adopting a, quote, different socialism from the Soviet variety, democratic socialism, and taking an implicitly critical position on the USSR. The, quote, theoretical meaning of this, quote, scientific concept, end quote, had not been broached, a consideration which led Althusser to the sanguine conclusion that it would reappear on the agenda. After a brief discussion of the slogan, Union of the People of France, Althusser came to the crucial issues raised by the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the transition to socialism, the conception of socialism, the theory of the state, and so on, questions which the Congress had tabled in determining the concept's redundancy. He began by insisting that the reality of the, quote, class dictatorship, or, quote, rule, of the bourgeoisie and capitalist social formations, contemporary France included, explained the formula, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. It referred to a type of state, signifying the, quote, class rule of the proletariat and its allies in economic production, politics, and ideology, a rule whose, quote, political form was a, quote, mass democracy, generally superior to the capitalist democracy, and whose rationale was the counteraction of bourgeois class rule, the transformation of its institutional forms via, quote, destruction or, quote, revolutionization of the bourgeois state apparatus, the prevention of capitalist resurgence, the development towards communism. If this point was grasped, Althusser believed a way could be found out of what he labeled the, quote, absurd dilemma, either pure theory or pure historical relativism, end quote. The notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat did not exclude allied classes from power. It did not prescribe mandatory forms of transition, violence, or post-revolutionary regime, dictatorship, quite the reverse. It indicated and was a response to the ultimate reality, the content of any form of bourgeois state, dictatorial or democratic, a reality the working class and its allies would have to confront both before and after the attainment of state power, if communism was to be realized. It thus did not rule out peaceful transition. Given a favorable correlation of forces, it directed the attention of socialist strategy to the existing balance of forces. To Althusser's mind, the current configuration in France was auspicious, as it had not been in Russia in 1917. The abandonment of the dictatorship of the proletariat had focused minds on this potentiality and the necessity of the, quote, broadest possible alliance around the working class, end quote, desiderata which Stalinist, quote, workerism had occluded, but in treating Stalinist dogma as the, quote, truth of the Marxist and Leninist tradition on the state, the Congress had inhibited itself from understanding that its own formulations were compatible with the latter. An accurate appreciation of the classical precept was also crucial to a realistic conception of socialism, itself a precondition of a viable strategy for communism. Socialism had been presented in Stalinist fashion as a, quote, stable mode of production, rather than as Marx and Lenin had conceived it, a, quote, contradictory period of transition between capitalism and communism, end quote. There was no socialist mode of production. Socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, was itself the, quote, transition period from capitalism to communism. Several different historical outcomes were conceivable: regression to capitalism, retardation in socialism, progress towards communism. If this was the case, then the strategy of the workers' movement had to be one of communism. From the standpoint of a transition to communism, the Congress's vision of socialism was utopian, conjuring away problems and fostering illusions, as was its handling of the problem of the state under socialism, another area where the failure to think through the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat left its mark. A basic thesis of Marxism and Leninism was that, quote, "it is not just the bourgeois state that is oppressive, but any state," end quote, including the revolutionary state. Marx and Lenin had treated the, quote, "destruction of the bourgeois state and the, quote, withering away of the socialist state a temporary expedient conjointly. The former was a quite specific operation, quote, revolutionization, end quote, of the existing state apparatuses, suppression of some, creation of new ones, transformation of all, in preparation for the, quote, withering away of the state, end quote, i.e. its replacement by mass organizations, end quote. Althusser pronounced this requirement to be, quote, part of the Marxist theory of the state, end quote. The, quote, destruction of the bourgeois state was the necessary precondition for the eventual, quote, withering away of the state per se and the attainment of a classless future, communism. The, quote, socialist countries offered a grim warning of the consequences that would ensue from the failure to anticipate and embark on this task. In the very act of unwittingly posing this question, the 22nd Congress had deprived itself of the means with which to answer it. Sixthly and finally, Althusser turned to the area of inter-party democracy, and in particular to the vexed question of, quote, democratic centralism, and, quote, noting the disparity between the abundance of freedoms the PCF promised France and its parsimony towards its own membership. The Comintern principle is upheld by Althusser as a response to the, quote, vital political necessity of ensuring the best possible unity, of thought and action in the party, end quote. But it derived its urgency from an even greater imperative, namely that the party's, quote, existence is vital, for the struggle of the working class, to provide it with a vanguard organization, end quote. It was according to this criterion that actually existing democratic centralism in the Communist Party of France should be judged. For organizational forms could effectively contradict the party's raison d'etre. The modus operandi of democratic centralism in the PCF was indeed dysfunctional, eliminating opposition and fabricating unanimity. The party's apparatus controlled its inner life. For Althusser, this was not a result inherent in Leninist principles of organization. On the contrary, at the same time, however, the PCF's shortcomings were not remediable by the restoration of organized tendencies, the norm in the Bolshevik Party until the 10th Congress in 1921. Such groupings were apparently, quote, out of the question in the French party and, quote, a threat to its unity and a diversion from the real issues. What was required if the PCF was to perform its proper function was, quote, more freedom, end quote, and an end to, quote, bureaucratic centralism, end quote. In optimistic vein, Althusser conjectured that the time was propitious for a discussion about democratic centralism, its substantial modification, so that the party could fulfill its raison d'etre, and in so doing become the, quote, party of the 22nd Congress, end quote. Althusser's text did not go down well with the leadership of the Communist Party of France. Finally delivered to a meeting of the UEC in December 1976, the text's publication in the party press is apparently vetoed. It is not hard to see why. For although Althusser's address marked a change of political direction away from Maoism, it is by no means represented by an accommodation with the official line. Althusser's serious reorientation towards Eurocommunism stopped well short of endorsing the particular variant adopted by the Communist Party of France in the 1970s. On Stamokap, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the program of national democratic socialism, the inter-party regime, and so on, Althusser adopted positions more critical of his party than he himself either understood or for tactical reasons elected publicly to admit. Herein lay the irony. Althusser's generally positive appreciation of the initiatives of the 22nd Congress was based upon his identification of an evolutionary logic which would, he believed, propel the PCF beyond the halfway house it had thus far attained. But this assessment of what was involved in the PCF becoming the party of the 22nd Congress was contradicted by the very different evolutionary process at work. Pace Althusser, the Communist Party of France was not in transition to internal democracy and a strategy of for a revolutionary rupture with French capitalism. In becoming the party of the 22nd Congress, the Communist Party of France was furthering the process of social democratization of the Western Communist parties evident since the 1950s. The surprising feature of Althusser's text is the spectacle of the former champion of the, quote, Marxist-Leninist theory of the state, end quote, recording the abandonment of one of its main planks with a certain serenity as a result of his confidence in the PCF's trajectory. Althusser's starting point is less controversial. The proposition that the cumulative impact of popular struggles in the metropolitan heartlands and of revolutionary movements in the Third World had created a considerable potential for anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist advance in these years. Indeed, that advance was already being made. The counter-revolutionary offensives in the periphery of 1962 to 73 was checked and then reversed in the mid-1970s. The liberation struggles in Southeast Asia and Southern Africa, the Vietnamese at their head, were crowned with success. In Southern Europe, the Greek, Spanish, and Portuguese dictatorships lurched from crisis to collapse, in the last case opening up the prospect of a transition to socialism in the West more tangibly than at any time since the onset of the Cold War. In Italy and France itself, the communist parties were poised to assume a major role in governments committed to radical social change. Despite the signal setback in Portugal, a new, quote, springtime of peoples, end quote, was expected in many left-wing quarters. Whether the Union of the Left was a plausible vehicle for such a socialist renaissance in France is open to question. Here, Althusser's endorsement of the Communist Party of France's version of democratic socialism must give us pause. For a start, this socialism could not be divorced, as he appears to imply, from the theory of state monopoly capitalism which underwrote it. The Communist Party of France's strategic orientation was towards a, quote, advanced democracy, end quote, as the necessary precondition of any transition to socialism, a constant of its politics for at least 20 years, and the perspective from which Althusser dissented in the 1960s. According to the official doctrine of state monopoly capitalism, the contemporary phase of monopoly capitalism witnessed a, quote, fusion of bourgeois polity and the monopoly fraction of capital, thereby creating the objective basis for an alliance of the, quote, French people against this fraction and its undemocratic state. The Communist Party of France thus posited a contradiction between democracy per se and the dominance of a fraction of the capitalist class, which a, quote, anti-monopoly alliance, end quote, would resolve in favor of the former. The struggle was held to constitute a transitional phase prior to the transition to socialism, a phase which Claudine himself, an eloquent exponent of left Eurocommunism, termed the, quote, transition to the transition, end quote. Althusser did not go as far as his former pupil Poulantzas in relinquishment of Leninism and diminution of the objectives of socialism. But nor did he publicly line up with his colleague Balibar to defend that orthodoxy and confront the PCF's alternative strategy head-on as a continuation of Stalinism, not its rectification. Althusser occupied a position somewhere between the two. Althusser impeached the PCF's theories, but not really the PCF's politics, or rather, to the extent that he challenged the latter, it was in the form of a theoretical critique, thus arguing the congruence of the party's popular frontism with the Leninist tradition. He asserted the inadequacy of its theory to its new and largely positive strategic orientation, an inadequacy which accounted for the negative political features. How should this distinctive position of critical support for the PCF be characterized? Kallinikos has suggested that Althusser's politics in this period are best classed as, quote, centrist, and should be compared with the perspectives of Austro-Marxism, a prior attempt to steer a course between the social democracy of the Second International and the Bolshevism of the Third. Althusser counterposed to the PCF's Socialisme ou couleur de la France, not a strategy of dual power and frontal assault on the bourgeois state, but a combination of popular unity at the base and electoral alliance at the summit, with, quote, revolutionization, end quote, of the state apparatus. Althusser's, quote, third way was between one revolutionary socialism on the one hand. Althusser's third way was one between revolutionary socialism on the one hand and Eurocommunism on the other. As such, it is open to a number of queries. On the face of it, there is a world of difference between Althusser's horizons and those, for example, of Korea, as set out in the book, quote, Eurocommunism and the State, published in 1977, a work which proudly claimed the Popular Front strategy of the 1930s as the antecedent and vindication of Eurocommunism. From a Stamocap perspective, Korea argued for adopting the objective of, quote, democratizing the capitalist state apparatus, end quote, and appropriating Althusser's ideological state apparatus' essay in his support. Against this strategy of, quote, democratization must be set Althusser's alternative, quote, revolutionization, end quote. But are they ultimately that different? Althusser's 1970 essay, as we saw in Chapter 4, was amenable to both Maoist, ultra-leftist, and Eurocommunist, reformist readings. His text of 1977 is ambiguous, but tends in the direction of a distinctive variety of the latter. For although he denied the equivalence of, quote, democratization and, quote, destruction, categorizing democratization as potentially reformist, his characterization of the second fell short of its conventional content. It involved, quote, revolutionization, a definition which, for good or ill, is at some distance from Lenin's and goes part of the way towards the Eurocommunist thesis of the divisibility of the bourgeois state. The strategy of a democratic and peaceful transition via a war of position in which a new hegemonic historical bloc is gradually forged, and so on, is predicated on the bourgeois state lacking the basic political unity ascribed to it by classical Marxism, an integrity the rupture of which requires a revolution. If classical Marxism is right, then Eurocommunist strategy is fraught with dangers for the working class, its party/government and allies, and the lessons to be drawn from the Chilean experience may be rather different from those derived by Enrico Berlinguer on behalf of the Communist Party of Italy. Pace Carrillo, the issue is not so much the, quote, democratic potential of the ideological or representative parliamentary state apparatuses as the adamantine presence of the repressive state apparatus. A government of the left unbuttressed by organs of popular power could end either by capitulating, adapting to the order of capital rather than transforming it, or by succumbing to the, quote, special bodies of armed men, end quote, Lenin, and dragging down its dis/unarmed supporters with it. At the very least, it may be wagered that the, quote, last fight to which the workers' anthem refers would, at some stage, be engaged, if not as the result of the, quote, resort to force, end quote, envisaged by Marx for the establishment of socialism, then in the form of the, quote, slave owners' war, end quote, predicted by Marx in response to the prospect of its democratic advent. And in that confrontation, the revolutionary forces would face a rather more considerable opponent, domestic and possibly foreign. Let me repeat that whole sentence. And in that confrontation, the revolutionary forces would face a rather more considerable opponent, domestic and possibly foreign, than the monopoly bourgeoisie. Revolutionary violence is neither inevitable nor merely optional. All that can be said with some certainty is that an arithmetical majority for the left at the ballot box, and with it constitutional legitimacy, is no guarantee of either the power or the, quote, right to govern, as the murder of Chile yesterday, the agony of Nicaragua today, bear witness. Eurocommunism, the reversion of the West European communist parties and others to the strategic horizons of the Second International, would appear to be a defiance of the historical record. Born on the 21st of August 1968, date of the invasion of Czechoslovakia, was not its obituary written on the 11th of September 1973, date of the overthrow of Allende. The self-emancipation of the oppressed from economic exploitation, political domination, and ideological subjection is unlikely to be achieved by any such strategy, one whose themes and the objections to them are, of course, nothing new. And here it is worth registering the absence from Althusser's reaction to the PCF's program of any reference to the history of strategic thinking on the Marxist left. From the Second International to the Bolshevik tradition, from popular frontism to Eurocommunism or to the history of the PCF and its grand tournement, from the Third Period to the Popular Front to the Moscow-Berlin axis, from the resistance and coalition government to the Cold War, from ghettoization to de-Stalinization and the Union of the Left, inattentive to the historical sources and precedents of the Union of the Left in, for example, Kautsky's, quote, attrition strategy, end quote. Stalin's conception of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, and the theory and practice of the popular fronts in the 1930s, Althusser overindulged the illusions of Eurocommunism in its French version, a social democratic conception of transition joined to an unreformed Stalinist apparatus. Having finally rallied to the position of a popular front at base and summit and veritable inter-party de-Stalinization, Althusser failed to strike a balance, leaving himself vulnerable to the massive disappointment that failure, amid so many hopes, could be expected to provoke. Footnote. This is the more surprising given that Althusser's comments on the policy of the Western Communist parties in the article Note on the ISAs, contemporaneous with his intervention on the 22nd Congress but unpublished in French, amounted to a repudiation of the Communist Party of France's whole orientation. Quote, Most West European communist parties describe themselves today as, quote, parties of government, end quote. Even if they do occasionally participate in government. Even if they do occasionally participate in government, and it can be correct to do this under certain conditions, a communist party can under no circumstances be defined as a, quote, party of government. A communist party can under no circumstances be defined as a, quote, party of government, whether one is dealing with a government under the dominant control of the bourgeois class or with a government under the dominant control of the proletarian class, quote, the dictatorship of the proletariat. This point is of decisive importance, ... A communist party can, ... under no circumstances behave as an ordinary, quote, party of government, end quote, since being a party of government would mean being a state party, which either means that one serves the bourgeois state or that one perpetuates the state of the dictatorship of the proletariat, when the whole point is to contribute to its destruction, end quote. Althusser. Note that the Communist Party of France had been declared a, quote, party of government at every level, end quote, by Marché in March 1974, a formula which dated from the late 1940s. End footnote. Failures there were. The Eurocommunism to which Althusser had turned in refuge from Maoism itself rapidly came to grief as a plausible alternative to Soviet socialism. In Italy, the Communist Party of Italy elected to become a, quote, party of government rather than a, quote, party of struggle. The Via Italiana terminated an entente with the Christian Democracy from 1976 onwards, which was all to the advantage of the latter, quote, the Christian Democrats, bracket, making, in bracket, the history, the communists, the, quote, the compromise, end quote. ABSE, ABSE, 1985, or ABS. But it was in France in 1978 that the greatest reverse was suffered, for it was there that the parties of the left, jubilant after their triumphs in the cantonal 1976 and municipal elections 1977, were predicted to win an outright majority at the legislative elections. The PCF had grown dramatically after entering the Union of the Left. Through a vigorous recruitment campaign, its membership rose by almost 250,000 to 632,000 between 1972 and 1978. But as early as June 1972, prior to the signature of the Common Program, in a report which did not become public knowledge until 1975, Marché shared with his Politburo colleagues his anxiety that the socialists would be the prime electoral beneficiary of the envisaged alliance. They were. And, in the end, inter-party competition on the left counted for more than the hopes of the PCF militants and supporters. Exploiting manifesto disagreements as a pretext, the Communist Party of France ruptured the Union in September 1977, spent the next few months, the run-up to the elections, vilifying its social democratic partner, and patched up the coalition the day after the first round, 13th of March, just in time for the second. The result was a momentous defeat. If the Politburo expected the dismay of its activists to be discharged in rage against the leaders of the Socialist Party, it must have been disagreeably surprised by the sequel. The rank-and-file revolt was widespread, encompassing a broad range of party opinion left and right. Althusser's own response came in two stages. On the 6th of April, Le Monde published a long letter signed by Althusser, Balibar, the historians Guy Boy and Maurice Moissonnier, the philosopher Georges Labica, and the Germanist Jean-Pierre Lefebvre. Quote, in once again losing the elections, end quote, they wrote, quote, the left has not only lost a battle, an immense fund of hope has, it has to be feared, been dashed for a long time to come. A great popular force is in need of reconstruction. It will be a tragic response to try to conceal the extent of the defeat and of the problems it poses. In the space of a few months, hasn't the left starkly revealed its own political weaknesses and internal contradictions? The division, however surmounted, between the parties, the discrepancy between the language, the objectives in a political practice that is often routine and electoralist. The Communist Party knew how to take the initiative, to propose the Union and its program, but was it able to foresee the real nature of the difficulties and obstacles it would encounter, to find the means to overcome them by mobilizing the masses for the defense and extension of the Union? Did it know how to transform itself in order to become the instrument of the popular movement? Why wasn't it able to avoid the constant seesaw movement which by turns revives the dangers of, quote, right opportunism, and, quote, sectarianism, and the succession of volte-faces, which cast doubt on its strategy and the correctness of its methods of political work, end quote. Althusser. These were the questions being raised and discussed throughout the party, in contrast to party militants, apprised of the gravity of the situation in which the PCF now found itself. The leadership was alarmingly complacent on its root causes. Further, it was refusing to open the party press to members who dissented from Charles Fitterman's report of the 29th of March and the Politburo declaration of the 20th of March. Quote, the Communist Party bears no responsibility for the situation. The Communist Party bears no responsibility for this situation, end quote. Althusser and co. made it clear that they at least could not assent to the Politburo's, quote, authoritarian assertion of the rectitude of the Communist Party of France's line throughout, nor would they accept that the post-mortem should be conducted within its terms of reference. What was now needed was a genuine in-depth discussion and critique of the party's recent political history, unprejudiced by a fixed agenda and rigged verdict. Such an inquest acquired full and accurate information, complete freedom of debate and circulation of ideas, and the elaboration of initiatives from the base of the party. There could be no serious objection to demands for complete information, an open press, and a, quote, extraordinary, that is, Democratic Congress, since these were in perfect accord with the PCF statutes. Every communist knew them to be, quote, indispensable to an authentic collective analysis and discussion and any future recovery.
As it turned out, all communists but the members of the Politburo knew these things. Raised pour Althusser now moved over to the attack. To coincide with the Central Committee meeting of the 26th to the 28th of April, Althusser published a four-part intervention in Le Monde from the 25th to the 28th of April, entitled Ce qui ne peut plus durer dans la partie communiste. I have no idea. A revised version, including a preface that dealt with Marchais' report to that meeting, was published in the Théorie series in May 1978. In his rejoinder to the Central Committee deliberations, Althusser sharply criticized the secrecy surrounding their debates, after which Marchais' apologetic report was unanimously endorsed. In, quote, I guess this is a piece, Avancer sur la voie du 22nd Congress, I don't know. The PCF's General Secretary had ridiculed, quote, desk-bound intellectuals engaged in a, quote, monologue, decreed that, quote, the Socialist Party is responsible for the disunity and the defeat, end quote. Warned critics that, quote, we are a democratic party, not a debating society, end quote, and concluded on a triumphalist note, quote, the Communist Party is now and will increasingly be the party which the workers in France need, end quote. Marche. To Althusser's mind, this superior's discourse represented a, quote, system of ideological and political intimidation, end quote, of all those who had legitimate doubts about the party's behavior. The attempt to dragoon the rank and file and prevent debate was, however, nothing new. The very, quote, vertical structures of the PCF partitioned ordinary members from one another and reproduced the leadership's omnipotence. Lyrical on the subject of the collective discussion underway, Marche was predictably taciturn on its stage management in accordance with tradition. One second. Sorry about that. Where the hell am I? Where the fuck? Okay. Althusser proceeded to savage what he labeled the, quote, religious conception of the capital T truth and, quote, entertained by the Politburo, wherein it was the possessor and guardian of a truth with which the masses were to be, quote, impregnated. Marchais' exclusive concentration on the competition between the PCF and the Communist Party and the Socialist Party, Marchais' treatment of the class struggle by, quote, preterition, end quote, and his assumption of the leadership's infallibility bore witness to a total renunciation of historical materialism. Althusser's preface closed on a severe note. The real, quote, lag in consciousness was the leadership's. It was insufficiently conscious of the, quote, exigencies of the class struggle, end quote. This state of affairs had two interrelated causes: the wholesale abandonment of concrete analysis and the deforming influence on the party's theory and practice of bourgeois ideology. Given the party's subjection to this ideology and the isomorphism between its internal organization and the bourgeois state, the real question concerned its fitness to perform its revolutionary role. These themes were developed in the main body of the text. In the first part, titled Strategy, the Disguised Turn, Althusser rejected any Manichaean evaluation of the respective merits of the Communist Party of France and the Socialist Party. In contrast to the leadership, the Communist Party of France militants had entertained few illusions about the Socialist Party, but to assign total responsibility to the Socialist Party was, quote, to confuse dialectics with paranoia, end quote. In any case, who, if not the Politburo, had facilitated the Socialist Party's strategy of outmaneuvering the Communist Party? A more compelling analysis, one rooted in the facts, was arising from the base, quote, spontaneously, an occurrence which, quote, could really mark an epoch in the political history of the French party. Could really mark an epoch in the political history of the French party, end quote. Althusser. Contrary to the declarations of Fittermann and co., the Communist Party's strategy had not been altogether, quote, consistent. The leadership was dissimulating the difference, the contradiction between the official line of 1972 to 1977, collaboration with the Socialist Party, and that of September onwards, sectarian struggle against the Socialist Party, an adjustment which had led to the March debacle. In autumn 1977, the Communist Party of France's leaders had abruptly made the party's defense of its position against what was perceived as the threat from its partner the primary objective. To this, they had prepared to sacrifice the dynamique unitaire of the Union of the Left and the popular hopes invested in it. Fearful of any examination of its vacillation, the Politburo denied the turn of 1977 and took refuge in its own inherited infallibility. Unlike them, Althusser did not believe that the leaders were always right. It was not simply the errors of the past that stood in need of rectification. He argued, echoing previous sentiments, their causes must be investigated and tackled as well. The party's organization was an obstacle to these tasks. As the title of the second article put it, quote, a machine for dominating, end quote. Indicative of the Communist Party's command structure was that the common program had been a deal struck by Politburo and the Union of the Left, an alliance between two political parties under the firm control of their leaderships. The quote promises of this 22nd Congress had been reneged on. In the approach to the elections, quote, nothing was moving any longer from the base to the summit. Everything came from above. Quote, nothing was moving any longer from the base to the summit. Everything came from above, end quote. The policies thus imposed did not even have the merit of consistency. In a series of, quote, unexplained turns, end quote, would have been anathema one day. For example, the force de frappe and autogestion became articles of faith the next. The militants had to endure and explain these somersaults. Despite them, they could, quote, testify to the deep and moving trust which the workers placed, in the existence of the Union of the Left. In the existence of the Union of the Left. This trust had deep roots in historical memory, which encompassed not only the fraternity of the Popular Front, but all the crushed working class revolts in the history of France, going right back to 1848 and the Paris Commune.
the great historical struggles that followed the First World War and the immense social hopes that accompanied the resistance. This time, after a century and a half of defeats and painful advances, bringing no genuine liberation, the hope was there, and victory was at last assured, at arm's reach. Is it really understood what this means? The possibility or near certainty that, for the first time in history, an age-old tradition would be broken and victory secured. End quote. Althusser. The hopes and energies that had tenaciously survived the dissensions of September 1977 might not outlive the defeat of March 1978. A precondition of the PCF's recovery was that the leadership's traditional secrecy, part and parcel of the Stalinist legacy, should be terminated. Indeed, the whole party, quote, machine must finally be transformed. This is the demand emanating from rank and file, not just for their own sakes, but for the sake of French workers, quote, who cannot be victorious, without the Communist Party, but who cannot win this Communist Party, as it is today, end quote. Althusser. The requisite Communist Party was a, quote, revolutionary party, end quote, governed by a fundamentally modified democratic centralism. At present, in its, quote, structure and mode of functioning, end quote, the Communist Party of France resembled more the representative and military apparatuses of the bourgeois state. Two related features of the Communist Party of France's structures were highlighted by Althusser: substitutionism and the, quote, basic and absolute principle of vertical partitioning. The, quote, basic and absolute principle of vertical partitioning, end quote. The latter mechanism served to ensure the dominance of the higher echelons over the lower and to prevent militants entering into independent contact with each other. Organizational forms arguably appropriate to a previous era were now without the slightest justification. For the combination of the military and parliamentary models, quote, cannot but reproduce and strengthen the bourgeois mode of politics. End quote. Althusser. The self-reproducing leadership corps was bound by a, quote, pact of unanimity, end quote, whereby differences of opinion within it were concealed from party members. The party machine was a veritable, quote, machine for dominating, controlling, and manipulating the party militants, end quote. Althusser. The Communist Party of France's organization was authoritarian. Its ideology was a, quote, caricature. The confidence of militants in the leaders was exploited by the leaders through an internal ideology which identified the party with its omniscient leadership. Althusser believed this to be a crucial issue. Repeating the arguments of his intervention on the 22nd Congress, he insisted that party unity was not an intrinsic good. The raison d'etre of a communist party was to serve as an organization of/for working class struggle. Party unity must be subordinated to that primary obligation. Party ideology should, therefore, not be considered exclusively from the viewpoint of its efficacy as a, quote, cement of unity. At a theoretical level, the Communist Party's recent history had been one of, quote, official platitudes. End quote. Althusser. Marxist theory in the Communist Party had not emerged unscathed from the ravages of Stalinism. It was in a, quote, lamentable state, end quote, had, quote, reached point, end quote, disappeared, end quote. Althusser. The leadership was indifferent both to the global crisis of Marxism and to its national form, the erosion of historical materialism in the party. In place of Marxist theory, the Politburo had served up state monopoly capitalism, Stamocap, a doctrine which Althusser now scathingly attacked as a French version of Soviet orthodoxy. Stamocap was a theory, quote, made to order, end quote, predicated upon the idealist concept of, quote, objective interest, end quote, of the French people in ridding themselves of monopolists, and resulting in a voluntarist notion of class struggle as consciousness raising of retarded social strata.
The Communist Party of France had abandoned the concrete analysis of concrete situations with which Althusser equated genuine Marxist theory. The costs of this neglect were heavy, for such analysis facilitated both the, quote, discovery of the real, end quote, and the, quote, determination, end quote, of an appropriate political line. Averse to any such thinking, the Communist Party of France leadership clung to its concoctions, superimposing its ideology on reality, quote, applying it from above to anything that moves, end quote, a theoretical practice in conformity with the Stalinist tradition. In Marché and Fetterman's reactions to the election results, there was, quote, no concrete reality and no concrete analysis. Quote, no concrete reality and no concrete analysis, unquote, Althusser. Marché's resort to backward consciousness to explain the Communist Party's electoral stasis neatly sidestepped a contributory factor rather closer to home, the party's image and reputation. Quote, the leadership, end quote, Althusser reflected, quote, may imagine that the 22nd Congress is a fountain of youth that washed away the bad memories of the past. But people have a long memory, and blackmailing talk about anti-communism no longer cuts any ice at all. Talk away. It is all very well to be heir to the October Revolution and to preserve the memory of Stalingrad, but what of the massacre and deportation of recalcitrant peasants, baptized as kulaks? What of the crushing of the middle classes, the Gulag archipelago, the repression that still goes on 25 years after Stalin's death, when the only guarantees offered are words that are immediately contradicted in the only possible field of verification, namely the internal practices of the party, then it is clear that the bracket electoral and bracket, quote, buffer also lies in the party itself, end quote, Althusser. There had, after all, been, quote, real, quote, Moscow trials, end quote, right here in France, end quote, between 1948 and 1965, quote, abominations, end quote, for which no reparation had been made. The history of Stalinism in the Communist Party was an unfinished history. It could be ignored. It would not go away. In his final article, titled "The Solution: Leave the Fortress," Althusser recalled the Marxist tradition's emphasis on working-class self-emancipation, and contrasted with this the Communist Party's typical treatment of its members and of workers as, quote, others, instruments of a line determined outside their ranks. Having abandoned the, quote, principles of class independence, end quote, the party had, quote, reproduced bourgeois political practice within itself, end quote. Althusser. Stalinism with a human face it might be, Stalinism it remained. Manipulative of its members, the leadership was equally suspicious of those the party was supposed to represent, the workers and their potential allies. If a political organization was to be judged by its ability to attend and respond to its natural constituency, the Communist Party of France currently stood condemned. Confronted with anything outside the control of the party apparatus, the leadership invariably repudiated it, as in May 1968. Its habitual authoritarianism was particularly evident in its conception and practice of alliances. Rather than forging an alliance characterized by a, quote, primacy of combat, end quote, the Politburo had opted for an electoral compact marked by a, quote, primacy of contract, end quote. Worse, under cover of an agreement with Althusser, considered a, quote, unitary electoralism, witnessing to a, quote, right opportunism, end quote. The leadership had conducted a sectarian campaign of electoral competition against the Socialist Party, representing the Communist Party of France, domination of its partner as the hegemony of the working class. It had ruled out, quote, popular union and, quote, unity from the very beginning as a result of its, quote, deep-rooted, tenacious, and inveterate distrust of the masses, end quote. The Communist Party of France, Althusser observed, quote, exists in French society like a garrison in a fortress, end quote. This may once have had a rationale, but not any longer. The defeat of the Union of the Left represented a clear repudiation of the party's political and organizational practices. It was the denouement of a long drama. Quote, we must look things straight in the face.
The March 1978 defeat is the defeat of a political line and practice which are one with the party's fortress-like functioning and its refusal to go out and, quote, lose itself, end quote, i.e. find itself again in the masses, end quote. Althusser. Vacation of the fortress did not and should not entail the Communist Party of France's transformation into a bourgeois liberal party. Quote, like the rest, unquote. It meant, quote, resolutely involving the party in the mass movement, end quote. The party must draw on the strengths of its working class and popular base to, quote, change, quote, what can last, to quote, Jesus Christ, the party must draw on the strengths of its working class and popular base, quote, to change, quote, what can last no longer, end quote, Althusser, and in such a way as to preserve, or rather restore, the PCF's autonomy as a working class political organization. In particular, contrary to the advice of the bourgeois leader writers, it was not democratic centralism per se that was at fault. Althusser concluded his intervention by identifying four, quote, conditions of change, end quote. First, Marxist theory must be rejuvenated, quote, lucid, critical, and rigorous theory, end quote, was the precondition of the PCF's regeneration. Secondly, a critique preparatory to a reform of the party's structure and modus operandi was urgently required. Thirdly, a concrete analysis of the class situation in France must be made forthwith. Fourthly, a new kind of alliance should be forged between the working class and, quote, popular forces, end quote, one which articulated compacts at the summit and unity at the base, with priority accorded to the latter. This line of, quote, popular opinion, end quote, must eschew reformism and sectarianism alike. In response to the title of Marchais' report in the TOD edition, Althusser added that the course he was proposing could draw inspiration from the 22nd Congress on condition that its contradictions were recognized and its tendencies to, quote, democratic adventurism, end quote, checked. On the basis of the four principles he had outlined, the Communist Party of France could change. Quote, it will be able to leave behind all the equivocations and constrictions inherited from the past, to redeem its errors and failures, and to assist the rallying of the popular masses for their long-awaited victory, end quote. Althusser. In March 1978, both the Communist Party's most eminent philosopher and his party reached turning points. The former, the party, turned, the latter failed to do so. Jesus Christ, I fucked that up. In March 1978, both the Communist Party's most eminent philosopher and that philosopher's party reached turning points. The philosopher turned, the party failed to. Far and away the most directly political piece Althusser had ever published, the book titled What Must Change in the Communist Party, is also Althusser's single most powerful text. Thompson complains that Althusser's, quote, exposure, end quote, merely rehearsed long familiar criticisms of the Communist Party by Trotskyists, Socialisme ou Barbarie, the rebels of 56, Sartre, and the students of 68, and so forth. Notwithstanding the partial justice of this claim, Anderson's judgment that Althusser's critique is the, quote, most violent oppositional charter ever published within a party in the post-war history of Western communism, end quote. Anderson better captures the status of Althusser's intervention. Pace Thompson, the point is that it was Althusser speaking from within the PCF, and not Sartre from without. The novelty of the crisis of 1978 was that there were as many voices raised inside as outside the party, far too many for the leadership to be able to resort to traditional disciplinary sanctions. Doubtless it would have been preferable for Althusser publicly to have adopted these positions much earlier. May 68 is the indicated occasion. Had he done so, however, he would have faced expulsion, as the fate of Balibar in very different circumstances 3 years later demonstrates. Althusser had chosen to be, and to remain, a member of the largest working-class party in France. During his 30 years of party membership, he had missed the moments of 1956 and 68. Althusser did not miss the moment of 1978. That April, he made the transition from private to public opposition, breaking his silence to issue a left-wing manifesto on, quote, what must change, and, quote, in the most authoritarian communist party in Western Europe. It would be too easy to argue, quote, better late than never, end quote. But what would Althusser's French and British critics have said had he once again judged it inopportune? The moment come, Althusser acquitted himself as well as any of those named by his critic. I guess it should probably be critics. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe it's supposed to be critic. It feels like it should be critics, though. That said, Althusser's text was not without its serious faults. In the Thierry version, Althusser noted that for political reasons, the Communist Party of France, like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, had proved, quote, incapable of writing its own history, end quote. Althusser. And earlier, Althusser had reflected that, quote, once the book of errors is opened, the end is by no means as clear as the beginning. Quote, once the book of errors is open, the end is by no means as clear as the beginning, end quote. Althusser. Indeed, this is precisely where Althusser's admonitions themselves require interrogation. The main political motif and historical model of Althusser's critique is the Popular Front of the 1930s. Insofar as he gestured uncritically towards the experience as the necessary corrective to the present imbroglio, his text is in part a symptom of what he sought to cure. The references to the Fribourg Torres are only the most obvious, quote, slips of Althusser's pen, if anyone is to be credited with responsibility for the Stalination of the Communist Party of France. It is surely the self-styled fils du peuple. In his nostalgia for 1936, Althusser shared a certain historical, quote, amnesia with the targets of his critique. The, quote, Popular Front of Labor, Liberty, and Peace, end quote, launched to, quote, bar the road to reaction, end quote, was hardly an unqualified success for the French, not to mention Spanish masses. Footnote. Althusser was not, however, uncritical of the Popular Front experience, as the Torres's Pas de Manichéen, the title of an article in L'Humanité of 14th of August 1931, its worthiness is somewhat qualified by the particular circumstances of its enunciation in the midst of the factional struggle against the Barbe Calor group in the Communist Party. An instructive comparison with Althusser's text here is what is perhaps its immediate precedent in French communism, Jean Baby's Critique des Basses, or base. Baby, as in like baby, B-A-B-Y, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it in French, a significant communist intellectual, went on to become a Maoist close to the UJC, writing La Grande Controverse Sino-Soviétique, 1956-1966, in which he paid tribute to Althusser's, quote, remarkable studies, end quote. Baby's critique anticipated most of Althusser's points, but although it too featured, quote, Pas de Manichéen, end quote, Baby strongly criticized the Communist Party's leader for his contribution to the reigning, quote, authoritarian centralism, end quote. For another powerful internal critique, see the Unir group's Histoire du Parti communiste français, 1961-66. End footnote. If Althusser was critical towards what another rebel, Ellenstein, termed, quote, Gallo-communism, end quote, summed up in the Communist Party slogan, ni Washington, ni Rome, ni Moscow, he was evasive about the Eurocommunism by which Ellenstein and others wanted it replaced. Politically, Althusser sided neither with the pro-Italian current North Marche and the center North the Leroy group, let alone Therese's widow and Stalin's ghost, Jeanette Vermeersch. Indeed, the level of generality at which political strategy is treated in Althusser's text makes precise judgment of his personal orientation difficult. His position was too idiosyncratic to be assimilated to any current in the Politburo. He did not want the party to take the Italian or Russian roads. He was no happier with national communism. Like Ellenstein, Althusser wanted much greater freedom in the party, but not the abolition of democratic centralism, and not the lifting of the ban on organized tendencies. In common with the hardliners, Althusser was concerned about the abrogation of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but for different reasons. Unlike Leroy et al., Althusser was not demanding a reversion to the quasi-quote third period, end quote, or post-1947 relations with the socialists. No more was he calling for a return to unconditional electoral alliance with them. On the contrary, in opposition to both, quote, democratic adventurism, end quote, and, quote, sectarianism, he set his sights on a genuine popular front. Althusser's history, then, was cursory and deficient. Althusser's proposals for a reform of bureaucratic centralism were inadequate in the light of his own systematic indictment of it. Althusser's politics, however elusive and independent, remain within the strategic framework Althusser criticized, and last but not least, for all that his intervention amounted to, a mordant critique of the PCF's tactics, organization, and ideology, it ultimately registered little advance over previous initiatives. In other words, the major problem with it is not its belatedness relative to Sartre's book Spectre of Stalin or Baby's Critique de Basse, even if Le Retard de 1956 was not only the PCF's, but the fact that Althusserian Marxism largely reproduced rather than really improving upon their analyses of the iron law of oligarchy in the Communist Party. What was the fate of Althusser's text and of the wider rebellion convulsing the Communist Party? As in the past, its leadership weathered the storm. Althusser's belief that, quote, blackmailing talk about anti-communism, end quote, would not wash this time prove false. The Politburo's appeals to party members to hold the line against the, quote, new wave of anti-communism, end quote, a palpable reality, worked their magic. Equally effective was a strategy of divide and rule, whereby the intellectuals, in any case at odds with each other, were marginalized. Footnote: the leadership could rely here upon an inveterate distrust of intellectual celebrities with access to the, quote, bourgeois press, to criticize the party in whose pages was traditionally held porteur de l'eau au moulin de l'adversaire. Althusser himself reproved, quote, recourse to the bourgeois press and its blackmail of the party, end quote, at the Fête de l'Humanité in 1973, when commenting on the, quote, Dye affair. See La France Nouvelle, 18th of September 1973, page 11. End footnote. If the first reflex of the rank and file after Marx was rebelled, its second, and one much more ingrained, was loyalty. At a higher price, order was restored without resort to expulsions. By mid-June, every federation had passed Marché's report. At the 23rd Congress the following May, Marché beat both, quote, right and, quote, left. Its leadership entrenched, the PCF failed to change, as so many had hoped and argued, ushering in consequence, the, quote, French political winter, end quote, during which the party would experience the most serious crisis in its history, entering the second half of the 1980s fighting for its political life. In May 1978, Althusser gave a short interview to Pace Sarah, in which he further castigated Marché's, quote, non-reply, advised that resignations from the PCF would be, quote, the best present one could give the leadership and Marché, exactly what they want, end quote, and asserted that, quote, it is absolutely vital to stay in the party and fight for its transformation, end quote. The situation in which the Communist Party found itself, he contended, was inherent in the signature of the common program. Footnote: Althusser accepted a suggestion from his interviewer that his criticisms of the Communist Party's structure and methods equally applied to other Western Communist parties, a statement for which he was accused by the Communist Party's Paul Laurent of having, quote, declared war, end quote, on them. End footnote. The following month, Althusser informed Les Nouvelles Littéraires that his intervention, like those of a growing number of communist intellectuals, was founded upon a, quote, wish for more democracy, end quote. Quote, if I did not believe, end quote, Althusser was quoted as saying, quote, that the positions which I defend have a future, I would not defend them. As to whether this hope will be disappointed, that's another matter. Anything can happen. I'm excommunicated today, but I have no desire to be a martyr. I'm a philosopher. I'm not caught up by the effects of everyday public politics, which is what is condemning me for the time being. But once again, I don't work in the immediate present. End quote. Althusser. Quote, unless the party disappears, end quote, Althusser insisted he would remain a member of it because, quote, the fact of having joined the party in 1948 is not a biographical accident for me. It was the absolute precondition for being able to be a political activist, dot, dot, dot. The fact of being in the party has given my philosophical writings a political significance. If I left the party, that would be finished. End quote. Althusser. Althusser was to make no further written contribution to the campaign to change the Communist Party of France, although his colleagues did. See Balibar et al. 1979. And although Althusser remained a party member, there were to be no more published philosophical writings, for what did happen was, quote, biographical accident, unquote.
New section, Adieu to Althusserianism. Vincent de Combe has suggested that with the institution of the primacy of, quote, lived experience, in his article, or his piece, preface to Capital Volume 1, Althusser did away with Althusserianism. Quote, Althusser did away with Althusserianism, end quote. Vincent de Combe. Certainly, as has been illustrated in Chapter 4, Althusser retreated from the most original, but also some of the more questionable aspects of his initial project within Marxism, and offered no alternative of comparable novelty and power. But to speak as de Combe proceeds to, of the Althusserian enterprise being brought to a, quote, official close, end quote, is an exaggeration, although its prestige had been dented. In 1969, Althusser's Marxism was still in the ascendant in France and elsewhere, and where there was a de facto retraction of high Althusserianism, there was no intimation on Althusser's part, at least, that he and his colleagues believed they had nothing new to offer. One indication of this, perhaps, is that the majority of volumes in the Theory series were published after 1969. It was not at the end of the 1960s, but in the second half of the 1970s, that Althusser's Marxism entered into crisis. The article Crisis of Marxism repudiated the strategy underlying the books For Marx and Reading Capital, and cast a skeptical glance over the theories of Marx and Lenin themselves that would have been unthinkable as late as 1975. It was in Venice in 1977 that Althusser heralded the end of an era. In his survey of historical materialism since the 1970s, Anderson has argued that the term, quote, crisis of Marxism, end quote, is a misnomer, since what was actually involved was a crisis of Latin Marxism, a phenomenon which had taken two main forms: renunciation, for example, Glucksmann, Coletti, and Sempron, or, quote, dilution or diminution, end quote, such as Althusser and Palancis. The perception of a crisis of Marxism among its Southern European partisans in the 1970s was certainly no idiosyncrasy of Althusser's. Claudine, for example, or Claudine, had anticipated him by 7 years, and was to be praised for having done so, Coletti by 3. In 1979, subsequent to the apostasies of Coletti and Claudine, Sebastiano Timpanaro would announce a similar conclusion, but recommend a different reaction. The peculiarity of Althusser's evolution within this wider history was that, unlike Coletti, he remained a Marxist, while unlike Timpanaro, he questioned the validity of the Marxist legacy and relinquished Althusserianism. Striking evidence of this is to be found in the text never published in France, dating from late 1977/early 1978, titled Marxism Today, a document gleefully described by Coletti, no mean butcher himself, as a, quote, wholesale slaughter, end quote, of historical materialism. Measured against the balance sheet he had drawn up in 1965,
The article, Theory, Theoretical Practice, and Theoretical Formation, Althusser's considerations on the state and status of Marxism in the article, Marxism Today, are remarkable for their simultaneous, indivisible attenuation of historical materialism and abnegation of Althusserianism. He began by suggesting that in once denying he was a Marxist, Marx himself had cautioned against interpretation of his thought as a, quote, system, a philosophy of history or science of political economy. The subtitle of Marx's Capital signified Marx's disclaimer of any pretension to, quote, science. Marx had transformed the very meaning of the term, quote, critique, his, quote, critique of political economy, and, quote, representing not an epistemological enterprise, but a theoretico-political prise de position for the working class. The thought of Marx and Engels had become, quote, critical and revolutionary, and, quote, inside the workers' movement through their participation in its practice. Kautsky and Lenin had, it transpired, been wrong, and dangerously so. Quote, behind this view of a scientific theory produced by bourgeois intellectuals and, quote, introduced from without, end quote, into the working class movement, lies a whole conception of the relations between theory and practice, between the party and the mass movement, and between party leaders and simple militants, which reproduces bourgeois forms of knowledge and power in their separation. End quote. Althusser. Footnote. Thus Althusser unequivocally assented to views from which he previously dissented, entertained by Marx himself on the relationship between historical materialism and the workers' movement. End footnote. Against the Kautskist and Leninist genealogy of historical materialism was to be set the primacy of the, quote, direct and practical experience, end quote, its founders had of exploitation, and workers' resistance to it in England and France. Marx, quote, became, quote, the organic intellectual of the proletariat, end quote, end quote. Moreover, the experiential dimension had been determinant throughout Marx's career. His theory had been fashioned, tested, and developed in the crucible of class struggle, and what was true of his lifetime held good thereafter. Quote, we can respond to Kautsky's formula as follows. Marx's thought was formed and developed inside the working class movement, on the basis of that movement and its positions. It was from within the working class movement, paying its way through struggles and contradictions, that Marx's thought was diffused from the first Marxist circles to the great mass parties, end quote. Althusser. If Lenin was wrong to take up Kautsky's formula of importation, he had also erred in developing Engels' thesis of the, quote, three sources of Marxism, for he had thereby fallen into the, quote, platitude of a history of ideas and, quote, quite incapable of accounting for the intimate relation between Marx's discovery of a social reality occluded in and by the problematic of German idealism and his adoption of proletarian theoretical positions. To write the history of Marxism under the sign of the history of ideas was to traduce Marx's revolution in thought, reducing it to a series of, quote, inversions of English political economy into economic science, of German philosophy into dialectical materialism, and of French utopian socialism into a, quote, materialist philosophy of history, and, quote, practical version, end quote, of this same, quote, messianism, end quote, scientific socialism. The problem, however, was that if this presentation of Marxism, orthodoxy from the Second International onwards, was not explicitly licensed by Marx, no more was it a mere invention. Marx had alluded to a, quote, inversion of Hegel, had, despite adopting an increasingly critical stance towards it, remained attached to the idea of a philosophy of history, and had speculated on a, quote, transparent social formation beyond capitalism, communism, that would usher in an Edenic, quote, kingdom of freedom, end quote. Marx's writings were thus shot through with, quote, latent or manifest idealism, end quote, from the, quote, materialist and, quote, philosophy of history profiled in the book The German Ideology via the, quote, evolutionism, end quote, of the 1859 preface to the, quote, fictive unity, end quote, of the book Capital itself. Footnote: in his interview with Rosanda, Althusser had argued that Marx's theory was, quote, finite, end quote, limited to the analysis of the capitalist mode of production and of its contradictory tendency, which opens up the possibility of the transition to the abolition of capitalism, end quote. Althusser. End footnote. Indeed, in its conception of science, Marx's Capital was all too indebted to Hegel. Footnote: Althusser broached this issue in his 1977. First broached this issue in his 1977 foreword to Gérard Duménil's Le Concept des lois économiques dans le Capital, published in 1978, written in what he described as a conjuncture of, quote, historical and theoretical retreat, end quote. Its theses on the Marx-Hegel relationship should be compared with their polar opposites in the book Reading Capital. End footnote. The effect of a more than residual allegiance could be located at precise points in Marx's magnum opus. For example, a tendency to a, quote, economistic interpretation of exploitation, end quote, which abstracted from its, quote, concrete conditions, end quote. So although Kautsky and Lenin had misinterpreted Marx's thought, unwittingly subverting Marx's thought's revolutionary status, Marx had facilitated their misinterpretations through his failure wholly to settle accounts with his former philosophical conscience. Unlike Lenin, however, whom Marx now rebuked for his imprudent dictum, Marx himself had never harbored illusions about the omnipotence of his theory. He had presented his ideas in two different fashions and forms, first as, quote, principles of comprehensive analysis, end quote, for example, of the structure of socio-formations, and, quote, in theoretical form, end quote, and secondly as part of the reality they were advanced to explain, among the, quote, ideological forms, end quote, of which the 1859 preface speaks. In the latter, quote, Marx no longer considers, his ideas, as principles of explanation of the given whole, but solely in terms of their possible effect in the ideological struggle. Therewith the ideas change their form, they pass from, quote, theoretical form, end quote, to, quote, ideological form, end quote, end quote. Althusser. Here was to be found the genuinely, quote, materialist side of Marx's work. Yet despite his acute consciousness of ideological struggle, Marx was oblivious to the possibility that his own thought might be deformed and exploited, a blindness related to the paucity of his reflections on superstructure, law, state, and ideology. The Marxist tradition had added, quote, nothing to what it had inherited from him. Quote, it is a surprising paradox that from a theoretical point of view, Marxism is still at the stage of Marx, or rather somewhere short of Marx. Marx's thought has given rise to commentaries and illustrations, sometimes brilliant, most often dull, and to some applications, ... Yet for the most part, Marxism has been repeated and distorted or ossified in the process. This is an astonishing phenomenon, given that Marxism presented itself not as utopian but as scientific, and that no science in the world lives without progress which involves critically questioning its first forms of expression, its, quote, beginning. Nothing of the sort occurred in the case of Marxism, ... Up until recent years, when a movement of critical research finally seems to be taking shape, Marx's theory has never been recommenced or developed. Now this paradox refers us not only to incontestable effects of the class struggle and the domination of bourgeois ideology, which have kept Marxism on the defensive. Theoretically, it also refers us to lacunae in Marx. Among the most serious lacunae, Althusser reiterated, Was Marxist fair to pose the problem of the organization of class struggle in and through which his ideas would become a material force? He had not foreseen that any such institution would require an apparatus, and that the consequent, quote, division between apparatus and militants could reproduce the bourgeois division of power and cause problems so serious as to end in tragedy, end quote. Althusser. Rosa Luxemburg had sensed the danger, but had failed to tackle the problem theoretically. For the most part satisfied to repeat what Marx said, his successors had, quote, blindly plunged into the darkness of night, in the dark on the state, in the dark on ideology, in the dark on the party, in the dark on politics, at the extreme toppling Marxist thought into something utterly alien to him. End quote. Althusser. Marxism then had not simply not progressed. Beyond Marx, Marxism had regressed. With Kautsky and Plekhanov, it was converted into an evolutionist philosophy of history. Marx's Capital was habitually construed as a treatise of scientific political economy. And, on the authority of Engels' quote, unfortunate, late works, dialectical materialism was proffered as the Marxist philosophy, one supplying a, quote, absolute guarantee, end quote, of historical materialism, parenthesis, one of its regions, end parenthesis, of scientific socialism, its application. Finally, under Stalin, Hegel had prevailed over Marx and travesty became tragedy. Quote, in Marx's name, for years and years Stalin fixed the formulae of this poor man's Hegelianism, this absolute knowledge without exterior, from which any topography had disappeared, and for good reason, since the, quote, cages decide everything, end quote, the definition of the true was the prerogative of the leaders. The bourgeois ideology of the omnipotence of ideas triumphed in the monstrous unity of the state ideology. The masses only submit to the very name of their liberation. To account for this catastrophe, it was insufficient to invoke the influence of bourgeois ideology. The reproduction of its forms in the working class movement required explanation. Something only a comprehensive theory of ideology, which Marxism precisely lacked, could facilitate. Marxist leaders have related problems and quote deviations in their organizations to the intrusion of the dominant ideology, inattentive to the fact that the revolutionary organizations, quote, secrete an ideology for the purposes of internal unity. They had not been alert to the potential contradiction between Marxist ideology and this organizational ideology. Bereft of a theory of the party, they had not foreseen that the party, quote, could end up reproducing in the party itself, the structure of the bourgeois state, end quote. Althusser. Lenin, Gramsci, and Mao had in their different ways grappled with the formidable difficulties involved, but had proved unable to fashion the requisite theory of state, ideology, and party. Althusser was not, he insisted, implying that its absence was responsible for the history made in Marxism's name. Such a fantasy of, quote, historical mastery, end quote, rested on another idealist postulate, namely that Marxist theory was exempt from the vicissitudes of the history of class struggles from which it stemmed, and in whose, quote, deformations and tragedies, end quote, it was implicated. As to these, Althusser echoed Spinoza's celebrated rejection of moralism and voluntarism, quote, Marxism will not rid itself of the tragedies of Marxism's history by condemning or deploring them. That way lie moralism and theoretical and political abdication. It is vital for Marxism to recognize these tragedies, to take responsibility for them, put them on the agenda, and forge the theoretical means required to understand them at their roots. Nor does this have anything to do with the intellectual curiosity of illuminating an irreversible past. At stake in such a radical reflection is Marxism today. Marxism today. Let it finally begin to know itself as it is, and it will change, end quote. Althusser. Repeating the opinions he had expressed in Venice, Althusser argued that change had been rendered both possible and necessary by the contemporary pattern of class struggle, which had detonated the, quote, general crisis of Marxism, end quote, a political, ideological, and theoretical phenomenon. It was now vital to, quote, see clearly into the state ideology of the party and politics, end quote. Althusser. Marxism, Althusser concluded, had always been a, quote, critical position, end quote, at once locked in combat with the dominant ideology and itself under siege. Because its own fate was tied to the unpredictable course of the class struggle. Today, more than ever, the masses were, quote, on the move, end quote, and Marxism for so long in abeyance, quote, on the verge of profound changes, end quote. Marxists must follow the precedent set by Marx and settle their accounts, an operation which would extend far beyond intellectuals and parties, since, quote, in the last resort it is the business of the popular masses and the ordeal of their struggle, end quote. By way of response to Althusser's reflections, there is little to add to what has already been remarked of the article, The Crisis of Marxism. The two texts combine theoretical pessimism and political optimism in equal proportions. Both are injudicious. Viewed in the light of the disappointment of the optimism in March 1978, it is the pessimism that is thrown into relief and which endures. And in taking his scalpel to Marx, Engels, Lenin, Gramsci, and Mao, Althusser's autopsy was inflicting deep wounds on his own contribution, now located somewhere within the virtual theoretical nullity that was the recorded history of Marxism. In 1965, making his own the axioms of Lenin, he now criticized as tokens of idealism. Althusser had also cited Engels on Marx's Capital. Without it, and the scientific theory it offered, we would still be, quote, groping in the dark, end quote. Even with Marx, it transpired in 1978, Marxists have been doing little else vis-a-vis the state, politics, party, and ideology for over 100 years. No Spinoza's light had illuminated itself in the darkness. Seriatim, the theses of the books For Marx and Reading Capital were erased, together with the epistemological break, long-time first article of Althusserianism. Flawed from the outset, undeveloped since Marx, deformed under Stalin, compromised by a tragic history, replete with idealism, Flawed from the outset, undeveloped since Marx, deformed under Stalin, compromised by a tragic history, replete with idealism, historical materialism was now a very different creature from the omnipotent, because true doctrine of high Althusserianism. As was that other avant-garde science of yesteryear, psychoanalysis. In an essay written in 1976 but only published against Althusser's will 8 years later, the article The Discovery of Dr. Freud, Althusser queried its status as radically as he retracted claims previously advanced on behalf of Marxism. Rescinding the theses of the article Freud and Lacan, Althusser argued that Freud had not produced a scientific theory of the unconscious, and that Lacan's efforts to impart scientific, quote, form to the content of Freud's work had resulted only in a, quote, fantastic philosophy of psychoanalysis that has fascinated intellectuals for decades throughout the world, end quote. Althusser. Lacan had remained within philosophy, so too, the article Marxism Today implied, had Althusser in search of a non-existent object. Lacan was still credited with having repulsed noxious interpretations of Freud. Althusser did not even go that far in his own case. He urged no claims on behalf of his return to and reading of Marx. The books For Marx and Reading Capital were relegated to the theoretical void of Marxism after Marx. Amid ideological adversity, Althusser revoked the omnipotence of theory and in blatant voluntarist fashion apotheosized the practice of the masses. The article Marxism Today and Althusser's real autocritique one whose imbalance does its author and his subject less than justice. If a date must be chosen, it was 1977 to 78 that Althusser did away with Althusserianism. At any rate, with the article Marxism Today, the Althusserian undertaking proper came to a melancholy close. The starting point of this chapter can now be rejoined. The dissipation of Maoism, Althusser's own complementary theoretical and political stance, was no longer viable. Theoretically, he descended into pessimism and skepticism. Politically, he displayed a newfound willingness publicly to adopt oppositional positions. For the first time, questions of contemporary socialist strategy were addressed in his increasingly fragmentary writings, however imperfectly. Simultaneously with the retraction of his aggrandizement of historical materialism in the books For Marx and Reading Capital, the erstwhile, quote, Pope of Theory, end quote, hoped for a renewal of a Marxism now bereft of concrete models in popular practice. The masses who made history could also redeem theory. Some of the song at least remains the same. In the spring of 1978, Althusser witnessed the dashing of such hopes as he had invested in the union of the left. Paradoxically, theoretical dejection and political frustration gave rise to an uncompromising assault on the Stalinist legacy within the PCF. The book What Must Change in the Communist Party was a left-wing critique of Stalinism, even if it was not the first. In a remarkably upbeat interview dated July 1978 with his German colleague, Peter Schüttler, Althusser confided that he affiliated to, quote, the tradition of Marx and Lenin without any hesitation, end quote. Quote, I do not particularly like the expression Marxism-Leninism, which is too, quote, crude to correspond to reality. I prefer to speak of the Marxist and Leninist tradition, and which does not stop at Lenin, ... I think that some of the formulations of Marx, Lenin, and their successors, parenthesis, I am not talking about Stalin, end parenthesis, contain approximations, even errors. But essentially they are, quote, correct politically, even if it is necessary to go back over some of their theoretical formulations and improve them. Comrades who declare themselves against, quote, Leninism are justified if, by this, they mean the book, The Foundations of Leninism, by Stalin, fixed and glossed in an utterly tendentious manner by Stalin. If, on the other hand, they mean Lenin's thought, which contains its share of problems and even contradictoriness, share of problems and even contradictions, ... I believe they are wrong, end quote. Althusser. Complacent in public at least about the impact of the new philosophers, in this, Althusser's last published statement on the subject, Althusser revealed himself curiously unaware of the gravity of the crisis afflicting the intellectual and political enterprise he had defended for 30 years, a crisis which did not spare a master of Marxism and some of his pupils. Okay, so that is the end of Chapter 6 of The Eclipse of Marxism. Chapter 6 of Althusser, The Detour of Theory. The chapter itself is called The Eclipse of Althusserianism. The next chapter is a conclusion, which is titled Unfinished History.